Welcome! You've found your way here at the end of another day. Let your thoughts settle now. Let the weight of the hours fade piece by piece. Tonight, we are going to explore how settlers on the Great Plains survived winters that could kill in hours. For months each year, their world became a place of bitter cold and unrelenting wind. Temperatures dropped to 30-40 degrees below zero. Blizzards swept across grassland that offered no shelter, no trees, nowhere to hide. In this environment, staying alive through a winter storm required more than endurance. It required understanding how to turn the very thing that threatened them into protection. How did families accomplish this? How did they sleep when snow was the only material available to build with? Their methods were born from necessity, refined through harsh experience. They learned to read snowdrifts, to carve chambers within them, to manage heat without destroying their fragile walls. There was no comfort in these shelters, only survival. Over the hours ahead, we will move through the process of creating shelter from snow and living within it. We will see how settlers chose their sites, how they excavated and shaped their spaces, and how they endured the long hours of storms that could last for days. So settle in now. Let the story unfold at its own pace. The Great Plains stretch from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. This expanse covers more than 500,000 square miles. Before settlement, it was grassland, tall-grass prairie in the east, short-grass plains in the west. Across most of this distance, trees were absent. Rivers cutting through the landscape supported narrow bands of cottonwood and willow. These ribbons of timber rarely extended more than a few hundred yards from water. Between rivers, the land offered nothing but grass, sky, and wind. Settlers arriving in the 1860s and 1870s came from regions where timber was abundant. They carried knowledge of log construction, frame houses, shingled roofs. None of this knowledge applied on the plains. A single homestead claim of 160 acres might contain no trees at all. The absence of timber shaped every aspect of survival. Fencing required imported wire or laboriously cut sod. Cooking fires burned buffalo chips or twisted grass. Furniture was minimal, perhaps a crate for a table, folded blankets for a chair. Shelter became the most urgent problem. Without logs or lumber, settlers turned to the only building material the land provided in abundance: earth. They dug into hillsides or cut blocks from the prairie sod itself. These dugouts and sod houses became their homes. The structures were dark, damp, and crude. Roofs leaked, walls crumbled in heavy rain, but they provided protection from wind and some insulation against cold. For settlers who had travelled hundreds of miles with few possessions, they were sufficient. Yet even sod houses had limitations. A family travelling between settlements could not carry a house with them. Herders moving livestock across open range had no time to dig a dugout, and when winter storms struck suddenly, distance from home could mean death. The plains offered no caves, no rock overhangs, no natural shelter of any kind. In winter, the same substance that made travel impossible, snow, became the only available material for emergency protection. This was not an obvious solution. Snow seems like the opposite of shelter. It is cold, wet, and temporary. It melts under heat. It collapses under weight. Most settlers from eastern states or Europe had no tradition of building with snow. But the plains taught quickly. Survival required adaptation. Those who learned to see snow as a resource rather than purely as a hazard gained an advantage measured in hours of life during the worst storms. The technique was not invented on the American plains. Arctic peoples had constructed snow shelters for thousands of years. Inuit hunters built igloos from carefully cut blocks. Sami herders in northern Europe excavated snow caves. These traditions demonstrated that snow, properly used, could insulate and protect. Some settlers arrived with this knowledge. Scandinavian immigrants, particularly those from Norway and Sweden, came from regions where winter conditions resembled the plains. They understood that compacted snow trapped air and that trapped air slowed heat loss. They knew how to shape snow without causing collapse. Others learned from necessity. A man caught 5 miles from home as a blizzard descended had limited options. He could attempt to push through whiteout conditions, risking disorientation and freezing. He could try to outlast the storm in the open, almost certainly fatal. Or he could dig into the nearest snowdrift and wait. Those who chose to dig and survive passed the knowledge along. Within a generation, the use of shelters became part of plain survival lore. It was never common, most families outspent winters in their sod houses or dugouts, but it was known, discussed and remembered. The technique required understanding the landscape in winter. Snow did not fall evenly across the plains. Wind shaped it into specific patterns. These patterns determined where shelter could be built. Open ground accumulated little snow. Wind swept it away almost as quickly as it fell, but where the land rose or dipped, where old buffalo wallows created depressions, where fence lines or wagon ruts interrupted the wind's flow, snow accumulated. Drifts formed, long compacted mounds that could reach 10, 15, even 20 feet in height. These drifts were not uniform. The windward side sloped gradually. The leeward side dropped sharply, sometimes at angles near vertical. The interior varied in density. Surface snow remained loose and powdery. Deeper layers, compressed by wind and the weight of subsequent snowfall, became hard and stable. A settler needed to recognize which drifts would hold their shape when excavated. Loose snow collapsed immediately. Recently formed drifts lacked structural integrity, but older drifts, those that had been in place for days or weeks, compressed into something nearly solid. Testing was simple. A shovel thrust into a drift revealed its character. If the blade sank easily, the snow was too loose. If it required force to penetrate and the snow cut cleanly without crumbling, the drift was suitable. Location mattered beyond structural stability. A drift on completely open ground offered no additional windbreak, but a drift that had formed against a natural rise or in a shallow ravine provided some protection even before excavation began. Proximity to fuel sources was also considered when possible. Dried buffalo chips, though increasingly scarce by the 1880s, could sometimes be found near old grazing areas. Bundles of hay carried by travellers could supplement available fuel. But often there was nothing, only the snow itself and whatever the traveller carried. The decision to excavate was never casual. It meant committing to a location for the duration of a storm. It meant expending energy and body heat on construction. It meant trusting that the shelter would hold, that ventilation would be adequate, that the storm would eventually pass. But when the alternative was certain death from exposure, the choice was clear. Settlers learned to read the sky, to recognize the particular color and texture of clouds that preceded a blizzard. They learned the feel of temperature dropping rapidly, the quality of wind shifting from steady to gusting. When these signs appeared, those caught away from permanent shelter looked for suitable drifts. They carried what tools they had, a shovel if fortunate, a tin plate or bare hands if not. They began to dig. The work had to start before the storm's full force arrived. Once visibility dropped to arm's length, once wind made breathing difficult, excavation became nearly impossible. The window between recognition of danger and loss of capacity was often less than an hour. So they worked quickly, methodically, knowing that the hole they carved might be the difference between seeing another morning or freezing in the open dark. Autumn on the plains passed quickly. September brought cooler nights, but days remained warm. Grass turned from green to gold to brown. Settlers hurried to complete final preparations, harvesting the last crops, reinforcing sodhouse roofs, gathering every scrap of fuel they could find or afford. By October, the first frost arrived. Morning ice formed on water barrels. Mud froze hard in wagon ruts. The ground began to harden, making further digging difficult. Families checked their stores of food, their supply of fuel, their clothing and blankets. November marked the true beginning of winter. Snow fell in light dustings at first. These early snows melted quickly under afternoon sun, but each snowfall lasted longer on the ground than the one before. Temperatures began their steady decline. December brought cold that settled and remained. Morning temperatures stayed below freezing. Night temperatures dropped to 0, then 10 below, then 20. The wind, always present on the plains, grew sharper. It found every gap in walls, every poorly chinked seam around windows and doors. For settlers in established homesteads, this was the season of confinement. Travel became dangerous. Trips to neighbouring farms ceased unless absolutely necessary. Families spent most hours indoors, venturing out only to care for livestock or retrieve fuel. But not everyone could remain stationary. Supplies ran short. Medical emergencies arose. Messages needed to be carried. Young men sought work in distant towns. Herders moved with their animals, and sometimes people simply miscalculated, left home expecting to return before dark, only to be caught as conditions worsened. The storms themselves followed patterns. Some were brief, an hour of heavy snow, then clearing. These caused inconvenience but rarely danger. Others built slowly over a full day, giving ample warning. Settlers saw them coming and prepared or avoided travel entirely. The most dangerous storms arrived with little warning and lasted for days. The sky would be clear in the morning, perhaps with high thin clouds. By afternoon, a dark line appeared on the northwestern horizon. Within an hour, the line became a wall. Within 2 hours, snow was falling and wind was rising. These were the storms that killed. They struck suddenly enough that travellers found themselves miles from any shelter. They intensified quickly enough that turning back became as dangerous as going forward. And they persisted long enough that survival required more than just endurance, it required actual shelter. Temperature alone was not the greatest danger. Settlers had experienced cold before. They dressed in layers, wool against skin, canvas or leather over that. They understood frostbite, knew to watch for numbness in fingers and toes, knew the signs of tissue damage. Wind was the killer. At 20 degrees below zero with no wind, a person properly dressed could remain outside for some time, but add wind at 30 or 40 miles per hour, and the effective temperature dropped far lower. Exposed skin froze in minutes. Breathing became painful, disorientation set in. Whiteout conditions compounded the danger. When snow was falling heavily and wind was driving it horizontally, visibility dropped to nothing. A person could not see their own feet. Land and sky merged into a single white void. Direction became impossible to determine. People froze to death within yards of their own homes, unable to find the door. They wandered in circles, exhausting themselves, collapsing in drifts they might have used for shelter if they had recognized them before their strength failed. The storms had a sound that settlers remembered their entire lives. Wind on the open plains howled constantly, but storm wind was different. It came in waves, periods of sustained shrieking punctuated by moments of eerie near silence, then renewed assault. It carried snow with such force that the snow became abrasive, scouring any exposed surface. Inside even well-built sod houses, the sound was oppressive. Conversations had to be shouted. Children cried from fear. Adults sat in tense silence, listening to the wind test every weak point in their walls, waiting for the cold to find its way in. For those caught outside, the sound was worse. It filled the ears completely, making thought difficult. It masked all other sounds, no footsteps, no voice calls, nothing but wind. This sensory deprivation added to disorientation. Snow accumulation during storms reached remarkable depths. A storm lasting 3 days might deposit 4 feet of snow on level ground. But wind did not allow snow to remain level. It carved the landscape into new shapes, drifts and hollows, ridges and valleys, all made of snow. The transformation was total. Familiar landmarks disappeared. Fence lines vanished under drifts. Roads became indistinguishable from open prairie. A person who had walked the same route 100 times found themselves in an alien landscape. This was the environment that made snow shelters necessary. When caught in such conditions, when all landmarks were erased and temperature was lethal, a traveller had to create protection from the only material available. They had to dig. The psychological challenge was as significant as the physical one. Digging into snow, deliberately enclosing oneself in the substance that defined the threat, required overcoming instinct. Every part of the body registered snow as cold, as danger, as something to escape from. But survival depended on inverting that understanding. Snow was not just the problem, it was also the solution. Its very coldness meant it remained solid. Its abundance meant building material was unlimited. Its structure, when compacted, provided insulation superior to any fabric or hide. Settlers who lived through winters on the plains developed a complex relationship with snow. They feared it and respected it in equal measure. They knew its capacity to kill. They also knew it could be shaped, used, made into shelter. The first snow of the season was often welcomed. It meant moisture for spring crops. It provided water for livestock when creeks froze solid. Children played in it briefly before cold drove them back indoors. But by midwinter, attitudes changed. Snow became oppressive. something that restricted movement, that added to daily labour, that defined the limits of existence. Each new storm meant more fuel burned, more time confined, more risk for anyone who needed to travel. Yet even in the depths of winter, even when snow had piled higher than a man's head and temperatures had remained below zero for weeks, the knowledge remained. If you were caught out, if the storm surrounded you, the snow itself might save you. This knowledge was passed along through stories. Old-timers told of being trapped overnight, of digging into drifts, of emerging alive when morning came. These stories were not dramatic in the telling. They were matter-of-fact, practical, focused on technique rather than fear. The lesson was clear. Panic killed, but methodical action could preserve life. If you knew how to read the drifts, if you knew how to carve a space, if you knew how to manage heat and ventilation, you could survive conditions that would otherwise be fatal within hours. So as winter deepened and storms became more frequent and severe, this knowledge waited in the back of every traveller's mind. They hoped they would never need it. They checked the sky constantly when away from shelter, and they carried a shovel when they could, knowing that simple tool might someday be the only thing standing between them and freezing to death on the open plains. Blizzards on the Great Plains were distinct from ordinary snowstorms. The difference lay not just in snow quantity, but in wind speed, duration, and the combination of factors that made survival difficult. A blizzard was defined by sustained winds above 35 miles per hour, accompanied by falling or blowing snow that reduced visibility below a quarter mile. These conditions had to persist for at least 3 hours. Many plains blizzards exceeded these minimum thresholds significantly. Wind speeds during severe blizzards reached 50 or 60 miles per hour, occasionally higher. At these speeds, snow was not falling so much as being driven horizontally. The snow itself might have fallen hours earlier. Blizzards often involved no new precipitation, only existing snow being lifted and moved by wind. This distinction mattered. A storm with heavy snowfall but light wind allowed some visibility. A person could see drifts forming, could gauge direction by shadows or terrain features, but a blizzard with high winds and no new snow could occur under a clear sky. The sun might be shining above while ground-level visibility was zero. Temperature during blizzards varied. Some occurred when the thermometer read only 10 or 15 degrees below zero. Others struck when temperatures had already dropped to 30 or 40 below. Wind chill was the critical factor. At 40 miles per hour, a temperature of 20 below zero created conditions equivalent to 60 below for exposed skin. Frostbite under such conditions occurred in minutes. The nose, cheeks, ears and fingertips froze first, then hands and feet. Without shelter, a person would lose consciousness from hypothermia within an hour or two, sometimes faster. Death followed shortly after. The psychological impact of blizzards was severe. Whiteout conditions eliminated all visual reference points. The ground beneath one's feet became indistinguishable from the air a few inches higher. The horizon disappeared completely. Sense of direction failed. People caught in whiteouts reported feeling as though they were suspended in white nothingness. Some experienced vertigo. Others felt profound disorientation, unable to determine if they were walking uphill or down, if they were moving in a straight line or circling. This disorientation was not merely uncomfortable, it was deadly. Settlers attempting to reach safety in whiteout conditions often wandered in circles. They exhausted themselves walking, sometimes covering miles while actually moving only a few hundred yards. They froze within sight of structures they could not see. The stories of these deaths became part of plains lore. A farmer found 20 feet from his barn door. A child discovered in the morning, frozen in a drift that had formed against the schoolhouse wall. A mail carrier who never completed the final mile of his route. These deaths reinforced the central lesson. When a blizzard struck, movement was not the answer. Finding or creating shelter was the only reliable survival strategy. Blizzards had a typical life cycle on the plains. They often began with a shift in wind direction. The normal westerly or southwesterly flow would suddenly swing to the northwest or north. This shift brought Arctic air masses down from Canada. As the cold front moved through, the first signs were subtle. A drop in temperature over the course of an hour, an increase in wind speed, a change in the colour of the sky to a peculiar grey-white. Then the snow began. Initially, flakes fell normally, but as wind speed increased, the character changed. Snow began moving horizontally, then upward in swirling columns, then in every direction at once as the wind became chaotic. Once a blizzard reached full intensity, it could maintain that state for hours or days. Storms lasting 48 to 72 hours were not uncommon. During these periods, conditions did not improve. Wind remained strong, snow continued to blow, visibility stayed at zero. The end of a blizzard was often abrupt. Wind would suddenly diminish, snow would settle. Within half an hour, the air could clear enough to see distances again. But the aftermath revealed a transformed landscape. Drifts that had not existed the previous day now stood 8 or 10 feet high. Roads had vanished. Buildings were half buried. Livestock were found frozen in place or suffocated under collapsed snow. The shape and location of drifts followed predictable patterns based on wind direction and obstacles. A north wind created drifts on the south side of buildings, fence lines or terrain features. The leeward drift typically extended 10 to 15 times the height of the obstacle creating it. This meant a fence 3 feet high could produce a drift 30 to 40 feet long on its sheltered side. The drift started immediately behind the fence and tapered gradually downwind. The steepest face of the drift was typically closest to the obstacle. Old buffalo wallows, shallow depressions where bison had rolled and created bare patches, collected snow until they became filled at mounds several feet higher than the surrounding prairie. These filled wallows created smooth rises that were difficult to distinguish from natural hillocks after a storm. Ravines and creek beds filled completely with snow. A watercourse 10 feet deep might be filled level with the surrounding land. Settlers walked across these filled ravines, not realizing water ran beneath them. Spring thaws occasionally claimed lives when people broke through melting snow into creeks they did not know were there. The density of snow varied within drifts. Surface snow remained relatively loose, light enough to walk on without sinking more than a few inches, but 6 inches or a foot below the surface, snow compressed under its own weight and the force of wind. This compressed layer was what made drifts suitable for excavation. It held a shape when cut. It supported weight without collapsing. It provided structural integrity that surface snow lacked. Deeper still, near the ground, snow often contained layers of hoarfrost, ice crystals that had formed on the prairie grass before being buried by subsequent snowfall. These layers were weaker and could cause drift collapse if excavation went too deep. Reading these layers required experience. A person digging into a drift had to judge density by feel. The resistance of the shovel, the sound of the blade cutting through, the way carved blocks held together or crumbled. The interior temperature of snow was stable. Regardless of air temperature, the temperature within a well-insulated snowdrift remained near 32 degrees Fahrenheit. This was far warmer than the outside air during severe cold. This temperature stability was what made snow shelters viable. A space surrounded by compacted snow maintained a temperature well above the lethal cold outside. Body heat alone could raise the interior temperature another 10 or 15 degrees. A small fire could raise it further, though this required careful management. Wind was completely blocked by even a relatively thin snow wall. A barrier 2 feet thick of compacted snow was effectively impermeable to wind. This eliminated wind chill entirely, a critical factor in survival. Sound behaves strangely in snow. The material absorbs sound waves, particularly higher frequencies. Inside a snow shelter, outside noise became muffled and distant. The howling wind that dominated the open prairie was reduced to a dull, barely audible rumble. This sound dampening was both a benefit and a danger. It created a quiet environment conducive to rest. But it also made it difficult to judge whether a storm was continuing or had ended. Settlers sometimes remained in snow shelters longer than necessary, not realizing conditions had improved. Light penetrated snow to some degree. During daylight, even under several feet of snow, a faint glow was visible inside a shelter. This glow was blue-white and diffuse, providing just enough illumination to see one's immediate surroundings. At night, darkness inside a snow shelter was complete. Without a fire, there was no light at all. This absolute darkness was disorienting initially, but became familiar to those who spent extended periods in such shelters. The plains environment provided no alternative materials for shelter construction during storms. There was no wood to burn, no rocks to stack, no caves to enter. Snow was the only resource in sufficient quantity, and with appropriate properties to provide protection. This forced reliance on snow required a shift in perception. Instead of viewing snow as purely hostile, settlers had to recognize its properties as building material. They had to understand its structural characteristics, its insulation value, its response to heat and pressure. Those who made this conceptual shift gained a survival advantage. They could assess a drift and know immediately whether it would support excavation. They could estimate how much work would be required to create adequate space. They could judge whether they had time before the storm's full force arrived. This knowledge was not intuitive. It developed through experience, observation, and often through trial and error under desperate conditions. But once acquired, it became permanent, a skill that defined the difference between those who survived plains winters and those who did not. Snow accumulated unevenly across the prairie. This unevenness was not random. Wind shaped every drift according to principles that remained consistent from storm to storm. Understanding these principles allowed settlers to predict where usable drifts would form. This knowledge could be applied even during a storm when visibility was limited. A person could not see far, but they could feel the direction of the wind. From that single piece of information, they could orient themselves and search systematically. The first principle was simple. Drifts formed where wind encountered obstacles or where the land itself created protected areas. On completely flat, featureless prairie, though barely accumulated, wind swept it along the surface in a continuous low layer that never built up enough to create drifts. But obstacles changed airflow. A fence post, a pile of buffalo bones, even a clump of dried grass created a zone of reduced wind speed immediately behind it. Snow travelling at ground level lost momentum in this zone and settled. The size of the obstacle determined the size of the drift. A small sagebush might create a drift 2 feet long. A wagon abandoned on the prairie could produce a drift 50 feet long. The ratio was roughly 10 to 1. The drift extended about 10 times the height of the obstacle creating it. Terrain features functioned as obstacles. A slight rise in the land created a leeward zone. A shallow sewell or depression offered similar protection. Even on the apparently flat prairie, these variations existed. Most were measured in inches or feet of elevation change, but that was sufficient. Old buffalo wallows were particularly effective drift collectors. These circular depressions, created by bison rolling to remove parasites and shed winter coats, dotted the plains by the thousands. Each one was 5 to 10 feet in diameter and 6 to 18 inches deep. When snow fell and wind blew, wallows filled first. The depression sheltered the accumulating snow from further wind action. What started as a shallow depression became a raised mound as snow continued to collect. Eventually, a wallow could hold a drift 6 feet deep where the surrounding prairie had only inches of snow. Creek beds and ravines also accumulated snow disproportionately. Water-carved channels funneled wind and created turbulence that dropped snow. A creek might be only 4 feet deep, but the drift filling it could extend 8 feet above the original prairie level. The challenge with creek bed drifts was identifying them. Once filled with snow, they were indistinguishable from natural rises in the land. A person could walk over a completely filled creek and never realize it. This was problematic in spring when thaw made the snow unstable, but during winter it meant creek beds offered prime excavation sites. Fence lines created long continuous drifts. Homesteaders and ranchers had strung wire or built low-rail fences across thousands of miles of prairie. Each fence acted as a drift former. The drift on the leeward side often reached the height of the fence itself and extended many yards beyond. These fence-line drifts were reliable. If a traveller knew where a fence ran, they could find it during a storm and follow it to a suitable excavation site. The drift would be fresh, wind-packed, and structurally sound. The windward side of obstacles accumulated little snow. Wind compressed what did collect, but the quantity was minimal. The leeward side was where useful drifts formed. This meant understanding wind direction was essential. During a storm, wind direction was easy to determine. Face the wind, and the leeward side was directly behind you. Before a storm, recent wind patterns could be inferred from existing drifts. The steep face always pointed downwind. The gradual slope always pointed upwind. Drift shape itself conveyed information about age and stability. Fresh drifts had smooth surfaces with soft contours. Older drifts showed surface crusting where sun or minor thaws had partially melted the top layer before it refroze. A crusted surface indicated compression and consolidation below. These were the best drifts for excavation. The crust could be broken through easily, but beneath it, snow was dense enough to carve. Very old drifts, those that had persisted through multiple storms, showed layering. Each storm deposited a distinct layer visible in cross-section. These layers varied in density and hardness. Some were good for building, others were too weak or too hard. Testing a drift's suitability required minimal time. A person would approach the steep leeward face. This was where excavation would begin. They would thrust a shovel or knife into the snow at chest height. If the tool sank with little resistance, the snow was too soft. It would collapse during excavation. If the tool barely penetrated or bounced back, the snow was too hard, likely ice rather than snow. It would be exhausting to dig and would not provide proper insulation. The ideal resistance was moderate. The tool entered with steady pressure, but required force. When withdrawn, the hole remained visible. When a block was cut, it held its shape when lifted. This test took seconds. A practiced person could evaluate a dozen potential sites in a few minutes, even in near whiteout conditions. They moved along a fence line or creek bed, testing periodically until finding suitable snow. Size mattered. A drift had to be large enough to carve a human-sized space without compromising structural integrity. A minimum dimension was roughly 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 4 feet deep. Smaller drifts could not accommodate an adult lying down. Larger drifts were preferable when available. They allowed for thicker walls, larger interior spaces, and more secure structures. A drift 10 feet by 8 feet could house 2 people with adequate wall thickness on all sides. Location within the larger landscape influenced shelter effectiveness. A drift in a completely exposed area provided only the protection of its own walls, but a drift that had formed in a natural depression or against a rise benefited from additional wind blocking. These considerations had to be weighed against accessibility. During severe storms, a person could not travel far searching for the ideal site. They had to work with what was immediately available within a few dozen yards. The decision process was rapid. Scan for obstacles or terrain features, move toward the leeward side, test the snow. If suitable, begin excavation immediately. If not, move to the next possibility. Time pressure was constant. From the moment a person recognized they were caught in a blizzard, every minute spent exposed drew down their body heat and energy reserves. Construction had to begin quickly, but it also had to be done correctly. A poorly built shelter that collapsed was worse than no shelter at all. Experienced plains travelers developed an instinct for drift reading. They assessed possibilities almost unconsciously as they moved through winter landscapes. They noted suitable sites even when not in immediate danger, filing the information away in case circumstances changed. This awareness was survival consciousness. It operated continuously in the background during winter travel. Where are the fence lines? Where do the ravines run? How old are the drifts along that ridge? Which way is the prevailing wind blowing today? These questions had no apparent urgency under clear skies, but when conditions deteriorated, when the first signs of a blizzard appeared on the horizon, those questions became critical. The person who had been paying attention knew exactly where to go. The person who had not been paying attention faced a desperate scramble. They would cast about randomly, testing unsuitable snow, wasting energy and time. Their chances of survival dropped significantly. So drift reading was more than a technical skill. It was a habit of mind, a way of perceiving the landscape that had to become automatic. Every winter journey was also a survey of potential shelter sites. Every existing drift was evaluated and catalogued mentally. This constant assessment might seem exhausting, but it became second nature. Just as a person walking through a city automatically notes doorways and alcoves where they might shelter from rain, a plains traveller automatically noted drifts where they might shelter from a blizzard. The stakes were simply higher. Rain was an inconvenience. A blizzard was lethal, so the habit of awareness was cultivated carefully and maintained rigorously. It was taught to children as soon as they were old enough to travel away from home alone. It was reinforced through stories of those who had survived and those who had not. And when the moment came, when the sky darkened and the wind shifted, and the first snow began to drive horizontally, that careful cultivation proved its worth. The person knew where to go, what to look for, how to test, and when to begin digging. They did not panic. They acted methodically, following procedures that had been established through hard experience. Those procedures began with the first cut into the drift, the moment when snow stopped being landscape and became building material. The decision to excavate a snow shelter was never made lightly. It represented an acceptance that other options had failed or were unavailable. It meant committing hours to physical labour in deteriorating conditions. It meant placing absolute trust in a temporary structure made from frozen water. But when the alternative was certain death from exposure, the calculation was straightforward. A person caught 5 miles from home with a blizzard intensifying had 3 choices: attempt to continue towards shelter, remain in the open, or dig. Continuing towards shelter seemed intuitive. Home represented warmth, food, safety, everything a person needed. The instinct to push toward it was powerful, but this instinct killed more people than any other factor. In whiteout conditions, navigation became impossible. Landmarks disappeared. Sense of direction failed. A person convinced they were walking in a straight line towards safety often walked in a circle. They exhausted themselves, depleted their body heat, and collapsed in the open. Even if direction could be maintained, distance was deceptive. 5 miles in clear weather was perhaps 90 minutes of walking. 5 miles in a blizzard, with wind driving directly into your face, with snow filling every step you took, with cold burning your lungs, that could take 4 or 5 hours if it could be completed at all, and conditions worsened while you walked. The storm that was just beginning when you started your journey would be at full force an hour later. Your strength would be diminishing. Your core temperature would be dropping. Each step would become harder than the last. So continuing forward was rarely the correct choice unless shelter was very close, close enough to see even in reduced visibility, close enough to reach in minutes rather than hours. Remaining in the open without shelter was simply waiting to die. At temperatures below zero with high winds, a person had perhaps an hour before hypothermia became severe. 2 hours would be fatal. There was no surviving a 3-day blizzard in the open. This left excavation as the only viable option. But the decision had to be made while a person still had the physical capability to dig. Waiting too long meant arriving at the decision when hands were too cold to grip a shovel, when thinking had become sluggish, when exhaustion made work impossible. The warning signs were specific: fingers tingling then going numb, toes losing sensation, shivering that started as slight tremors and intensified to violent shaking, mental confusion, difficulty making decisions, forgetting which direction you were headed, repetitive thoughts. These were early hypothermia symptoms. They indicated that body core temperature was dropping. If a person experienced these symptoms and was still miles from permanent shelter, the decision to dig had to be made immediately. Delaying even 15 minutes could mean the difference between a successful excavation and being too weak to complete it. Many deaths occurred not from initial exposure, but from attempting to dig after becoming too impaired to do so effectively. The psychological barrier was substantial. Everything in a person's experience told them that snow was cold, that surrounding yourself with it would make you colder. The idea of voluntarily enclosing yourself in snow contradicted basic instinct. But survival required overriding instinct with knowledge. The person had to understand, intellectually and emotionally, that compacted snow insulated, that a space surrounded by snow would be significantly warmer than open air, that wind chill inside a snow shelter was zero because wind was entirely blocked. Some people could not make this mental shift. They froze while standing on top of perfectly suitable drifts, unable to overcome their revulsion towards snow as shelter material. Their bodies were found in spring, sometimes with shovels still in hand, having refused to dig at the critical moment. Others made the decision too late. They dug frantically, partially completing an excavation before exhaustion or confusion caused them to stop. Their partially dug shelters became their graves, testimony to the narrow window of opportunity that existed. But those who made the decision at the right moment, who recognized the signs of hypothermia onset and acted, immediately gave themselves a survival chance. They stopped moving forward. They surveyed the immediate area for suitable drifts. They selected a site. They began to dig. The work itself generated heat. Digging was physically demanding, heart rate increased, blood flow to muscles improved, body temperature stabilized or even rose slightly. This bought time, the time needed to complete construction, but it had to be managed carefully. Working too hard caused sweating. Sweat dampened clothing. Wet clothing lost its insulating properties. A person who dug frantically, soaking their clothes with perspiration, created a new problem while solving the immediate one. The proper pace was steady but controlled. Work hard enough to maintain body heat but not so hard as to sweat heavily. Rest briefly when needed, but not long enough for shivering to resume. Maintain continuous progress without exhausting yourself. This balance required discipline. The urge to rush was strong, the storm was worsening, time felt short, panic pushed toward frantic action. But frantic action led to mistakes and exhaustion. Methodical work led to completion. The first task was clearing the excavation area. Surface snow was brushed or shoveled away to expose the denser snow beneath. This created a clean working surface and removed loose material that would fall into the shelter during construction. Next came marking the outline. This could be done by scratching lines in the snow or simply by visualizing the shape. The space needed to be large enough for the person to lie down fully extended. Width had to allow rolling over. Height needed to permit sitting up, at minimum. These dimensions were approximate. Exact measurements were impossible and unnecessary, but the space had to be sufficient. Building too small meant being cramped and unable to move properly. Building too large meant thin walls and structural weakness. With the outline established, excavation began. The entrance was started first. A narrow opening cut into the steep face of the drift. This opening would remain the only access point, so its size and location mattered. It had to be large enough to crawl through, but small enough to minimize heat loss. Typically, this meant a tunnel perhaps 2 feet wide and 2 feet high. The tunnel would angle slightly upward into the drift, ensuring that cold air, which was denser than warm air, would flow out while warmer air remained trapped inside. The upward angle was subtle, just a few degrees. Too steep and the tunnel became difficult to crawl through. Too flat and cold air pooled inside the shelter. Experience taught the correct angle, but even novices could approximate it by simply keeping the tunnel floor lower than the interior chamber floor. As the entrance tunnel progressed, excavated snow was pushed or carried outside. It could not be allowed to accumulate in the work area. Some builders shaped this excess snow into a windbreak wall near the entrance, providing additional protection. The tunnel needed to be long enough that wind could not blow directly into the interior chamber. 3 or 4 feet was typical. This length also helped maintain temperature differential. The tunnel itself became a buffer zone between exterior cold and interior warmth. Once the tunnel reached its planned depth, excavation of the main chamber began. This was done by removing snow upward and outward from the tunnel's end. The chamber gradually took shape as material was scraped away and passed back through the tunnel. The work was awkward. Space was confined. A person often had to lie on their side or stomach to reach the upper portions of the chamber. Arms tired quickly from the repetitive scraping and carrying motions. But the chamber grew steadily, first large enough to crouch in, then large enough to sit in, finally large enough to lie down in. The transformation was visible even in dim light, from solid drift to hollow space in the course of an hour or two. Wall thickness was judged by instinct and caution. Too thin, and the shelter might collapse or allow cold penetration. Too thick and the interior space became too small. A minimum of 18 inches on all sides was safe. 2 feet was better. The ceiling required special attention. It had to support its own weight, plus any additional snow that might accumulate on top during the storm. Shaping it as a gentle dome distributed weight more effectively than a flat ceiling. The dome also prevented meltwater from dripping directly onto occupants if any melting occurred. As excavation neared completion, the builder made final adjustments. They smoothed rough spots that might drip. They ensured the floor was level or slightly sloped toward the entrance so water would drain. They tested the structural integrity by pressing firmly against walls and ceiling. If anything felt unstable, additional material was removed to find solid snow, or additional thickness was left in place. There was no formula, only judgment based on how the snow felt and sounded when worked. The final step was creating ventilation. This was critical, but often overlooked by the inexperienced builders. A small hole was poked through the ceiling or upper wall using a stick, knife, or gloved finger. The hole was only an inch or 2 in diameter, but allowed air circulation. Without ventilation, carbon dioxide built up from breathing and from any fire that might be lit. The build-up was gradual and initially symptomless. A person would simply become drowsy, fall asleep, and not wake up. Many deaths in snow shelters resulted from inadequate ventilation. With the ventilation hole in place, construction was complete. The shelter existed. It was crude, temporary, and far from comfortable. But it was shelter. A space where survival was possible, where the deadly wind was blocked, where temperature was endurable. The person crawled inside, pulling whatever materials they had with them. The storm raged outside. Inside, relative quiet descended. The waiting began. The entrance tunnel extended into the drift at a shallow upward angle. Beyond its end, solid snow waited to be shaped into living space. This transformation from solid to hollow required systematic removal of material, one handful or shovelful at a time. The builder worked from a prone or kneeling position. Space was too confined for standing. Even sitting upright was difficult until enough material had been removed. Arms extended forward, scraping at the snow face, pulling material back toward the body, then pushing it behind toward the tunnel entrance. The motion became repetitive. Scrape, pull, push. Scrape, pull, push. Push. Each cycle removed perhaps a half-gallon of compacted snow. Hundreds of cycles were needed to create a chamber large enough for human occupation. The physical demands were significant. Shoulders and arms bore the brunt of the work. Back muscles strained from the awkward positioning. Hands grew tired from gripping tools or clawing at snow, but the work could not stop until the chamber reached minimum dimensions. Temperature inside the excavation was warmer than outside, but still well below freezing. The builder's breath formed clouds. Exposed skin still felt cold, but the absence of wind made an enormous difference. Without wind chill, the same temperature was far more bearable. As material was removed, the character of the snow revealed itself. Some sections cut cleanly, breaking away into large coherent chunks. Other sections crumbled or required more force to penetrate. These variations reflected the snow's history, how it had fallen, how wind had compressed it, how previous temperature fluctuations had affected it. Ideal snow felt firm under the scraping tool. It resisted with consistent pressure, but yielded steadily. When a piece broke free, it held together rather than disintegrating. This indicated proper density for construction. Occasionally a builder encountered ice layers. These appeared as hard, glossy sections that resisted cutting. They formed when surface melting had occurred, followed by refreezing. Ice layers could not be removed easily and had to be worked around or chipped away slowly. More concerning were weak layers, sections where snow remained loose and unconsolidated. These appeared as sudden soft spots in otherwise firm material. They indicated places where the drift structure was compromised. If encountered, the builder had to decide whether to excavate elsewhere or reinforce the area by removing more material to reach stable snow beyond. The chamber's shape emerged gradually. Initially, it was merely a widening of the tunnel. Then it became a distinct space separated from the tunnel by a slight rise or change in direction. Finally, it became a defined room, its dimensions limited by the drift's size and the builder's ambition. Most chambers were roughly oval or circular in floor plan. These shapes were structurally sound and relatively easy to excavate. Rectangular chambers required sharper corners that concentrated stress. Circular chambers distributed stress evenly across all walls. Height was limited by practical concerns. A chamber tall enough to stand in required removing enormous amounts of snow and resulted in thin walls or ceilings. Most chambers were 3 to 4 feet high at the centre, enough to sit upright but not to stand. This limitation was acceptable. The shelter's purpose was sleeping and waiting, not living in comfort. A person could lie down, could sit to tend a small fire, could move around enough to prevent cramping. That was sufficient. As the chamber approached its final dimensions, the builder began refining the interior. They scraped walls smooth, removing loose material that might fall later. They shaped the ceiling into a gentle dome, eliminating flat spots where meltwater might collect. The floor received particular attention. It had to be as level as possible for comfortable sleeping. High spots were scraped down. Low spots were filled with excess snow and tamped firm. The surface was smoothed until a hand run across it encountered no major irregularities. Some builders created a raised sleeping platform along one wall. This involved leaving a bench of snow intact while lowering the rest of the floor. The platform raised the sleeping surface above the level of cold air, which naturally settled to the lowest point. This added several degrees of warmth to the sleeping area. Others created a small depression near the entrance for a fire. This pit captured ashes and contained heat in a defined area. It was positioned where smoke could exit through the entrance tunnel, rather than filling the chamber. Wall thickness was checked by pressing firmly or by punching a thin stick through from inside to outside. If the stick broke through with little resistance, walls were too thin. If it required significant force, thickness was adequate. Generally, walls needed to be at least 18 inches thick for structural stability and insulation. Thicker walls were better if the drift size allowed. 2 feet of compacted snow provided excellent insulation and virtually guaranteed structural integrity. But achieving this thickness while maintaining adequate interior space required a large drift, something not always available. The ceiling was the most critical structural element. It had to support its own weight and any additional snow that accumulated during the storm. If the ceiling was too thin or too flat, it could collapse, potentially trapping or injuring the occupant. The dome shape was strongest. Downward force on any point was distributed outward along the curve rather than concentrated at that point. This meant a domed ceiling could be thinner than a flat ceiling while remaining structurally sound. Creating the dome required working from the centre outward. The builder scraped away material at the highest point, then worked radially toward the walls, maintaining a consistent curve. They sighted along the curve periodically, checking for flat spots or irregularities. The finished ceiling resembled the interior of an upturned bowl. At its highest point, it might be 3 to 4 feet above the floor. Near the walls, it curved down to meet them at perhaps 2 feet above floor level. The entire surface was smooth and continuous. Lighting during excavation came from outside if work occurred during daylight. Light filtered through the entrance tunnel as a diffuse glow. It was dim but sufficient for seeing the work. As excavation progressed and the chamber deepened, less light reached the interior. The builder often worked in near darkness, judging progress by feel. At night or during heavy storm conditions, when outside light was minimal, excavation became far more difficult. Some builders carried candles or small lanterns. These provided limited light but consumed precious oxygen in the confined space. Most worked by feel alone, running hands over walls and ceiling to assess progress. The sense of touch became highly developed during the excavation. Fingers learned to distinguish between well-compacted snow and loose material, between structural soundness and weakness, between adequate thickness and dangerous thinness. This tactile literacy was essential for working in darkness. Sound also conveyed information. A shovel scraping against firm snow made a particular rasping noise. The same motion against loose snow produced a softer, muffled sound. Against ice, it created a sharp, scratching tone. These auditory cues helped the builder adjust their technique. The work generated surprising amounts of removed snow. A chamber 6 feet long by 4 feet wide by 3 feet high displaced roughly 70 cubic feet of material. Compacted snow weighed approximately 20 pounds per cubic foot, meaning nearly half a ton of material had to be moved. This material could not remain inside or block the entrance. It had to be pushed out through the tunnel and deposited away from the shelter. Some builders created a mound of excavated snow that served as an additional windbreak. Others spread it thin so it would not block ventilation or make locating the entrance difficult later. The physical exhaustion of excavation was cumulative. The first 15 minutes felt manageable. After 30 minutes, arms began to ache. After an hour, the work became laborious. By the time construction neared completion, every motion required conscious effort. But stopping was not an option. The storm outside continued or intensified. Temperature remained lethal. The shelter had to be finished while the builder still had strength. Rest could come afterward, inside the completed chamber. Experienced builders worked efficiently. They removed material in the most productive sequence, minimizing wasted effort. They shaped walls and coiling in ways that required minimal refinement. They judged dimensions accurately, avoiding the need to expand the chamber later. Inexperienced builders made predictable errors. They created chambers too small and had to enlarge them. They left walls too thin and had to abandon one site for another. They failed to account for ventilation or drainage and had to modify their work. These errors cost time and energy, but they also provided education. A person who built one snow shelter learned from their mistakes. If they survived to build another, they did so more competently. The moment when excavation was complete brought mixed feelings. Relief that the hard physical labour was finished, satisfaction at having created shelter from nothing, but also awareness that now came the test. Hours or days of waiting to see whether the shelter would hold, whether ventilation was adequate, whether survival was truly achieved. The builder crawled backward out of the chamber for a final check. They examined the entrance tunnel, ensuring it was clear. They looked at the exterior, judging whether the drift showed signs of instability. They felt the walls one more time, confirming the thickness. Then they gathered whatever materials they had brought. Blankets, glove-shielding food, tools for fire-making. They crawled into the tunnel, pushing materials ahead of them. They manoeuvred through the narrow passage into the chamber beyond. The entrance behind them remained open. Cold air flowed in, but not wind. The howling outside was reduced to a distant murmur. The space, crude as it was, felt enclosed and separate from the storm. They arranged their materials, bedding on the floor, fire supplies nearby, remaining possessions within reach. They settled into the space and letting their breathing slow, letting their body register the absence of wind. The chamber was dark except for whatever daylight filtered through the entrance and the ventilation hole. The walls gleamed faintly, ice crystals catching and reflecting the dim light. The ceiling curved overhead, close enough to touch while sitting. This was shelter. Not home, not comfort, but shelter. A space carved from winter itself, where survival became possible. The waiting could begin. Snow as a building material possessed properties that seemed contradictory. It was frozen water, yet it insulated. It was white and reflective, yet it created darkness inside structures. It was soft enough to carve with bare hands, yet it could support enormous weight. Understanding these properties required setting aside assumptions about more familiar materials. Snow was not like wood or stone. It behaved according to its own principles. The foundation of snow's usefulness was its structure at the microscopic level. Snowflakes fell as delicate crystals with intricate branching patterns. When they landed and accumulated, these crystals did not pack together completely. Gaps remained between them, thousands of tiny air pockets per cubic inch. Air is an excellent insulator. It conducts heat poorly. When trapped in small pockets that prevent circulation, it creates an effective barrier against heat transfer. This was what made snow insulating despite being frozen. The insulation value increased with snow density. Loose, freshly fallen snow contained more air relative to ice and insulated extremely well, but it lacked structural strength. It collapsed under its own weight or crumbled when handled. Compacted snow, the kind formed in drifts by wind pressure and time, achieved a balance. It retained enough air pockets for insulation while gaining structural integrity from ice crystals pressed together. This was the sweet spot for construction, insulating yet stable. The density of construction-grade snow typically ranged from 15 to 25 pounds per cubic foot. For comparison, solid ice was 57 pounds per cubic foot, while freshly fallen snow was often only 3 to 6 pounds per cubic foot. Drift snow fell in the middle range. This density could be tested by cutting a measured block and weighing it, but builders rarely carried scales. Instead, they judged by feel and performance. If snow held together, when cut but still required force to carve, density was appropriate. Temperature affected snow's properties significantly. At temperatures near 0 Fahrenheit, snow was hard and stable. It cut cleanly and held shape well. At temperatures closer to 32 degrees, snow became softer, more prone to melting under body heat or fire heat. The coldest snow made the strongest shelters but was also the hardest to work. Carving chambers from snow at 20 below zero was exhausting. The material resisted every cut. Tools bounced rather than penetrating. But the resulting structure was extremely stable. Warmer snow, nearer to freezing, carved easily but required more careful heat management. The builder's body heat could begin melting it during excavation. Later, any fire had to be kept very small to prevent significant melting. The crystal structure of snow changed over time through a process called sintering. When ice crystals touched each other under pressure, Water molecules migrated between crystals, fusing them together. This happened even at temperatures well below freezing. The result was that snow shelters actually grew stronger over the first hours after construction. The walls and ceiling gradually consolidated. What started as individual compacted crystals became a more unified structure. This self-strengthening improved safety margins. However, this same process could cause problems if temperature fluctuations occurred. A warm spell followed by refreezing created hard ice layers that were difficult to work with. Multiple freeze-thaw cycles degraded snow's structure, making it unreliable for construction. Wind's effect on snow went beyond simple compression. Wind caused abrasion. Crystals tumbling against each other broke off their delicate branches. This created more irregular, rounded grains that packed more efficiently. Wind-worked snow was denser and stronger than calm-deposited snow. The leeward side of drifts contained the most wind-worked snow. This was why excavation typically occurred there. The snow had been processed by wind action during deposition and was optimally suited for carving stable structures. Load-bearing capacity varied with snow quality and temperature. Well-compacted snow at low temperatures could support hundreds of pounds per square foot. A ceiling 2 feet thick could easily support a person standing on top of the shelter, but this capacity decreased near the melting point. Snow that seemed solid at 20 below could become dangerously weak at 25 above if conditions warmed. Spring was particularly dangerous. Shelters built in deep winter sometimes collapsed in March or April as temperatures rose. The dome shape used for ceilings was more than aesthetic preference. It was structural necessity. A flat ceiling experienced downward force concentrated at its center. This created maximum stress at the least supported point. A dome distributed force outward along the curve. Downward pressure at any point pushed sideways as much as down due to the curved surface. This sideways component was transferred to the walls, which supported it easily. The dome was essentially self-supporting. This principle allowed thinner ceilings than flat construction would permit. A dome could be 1 foot thick and stable, while a flat ceiling required 2 feet for the same span. This saved excavation work and allowed larger interior spaces from the same size drift. Walls required less engineering sophistication. Vertical or near-vertical surfaces supported primarily compression loads, the snow's own weight pressing downward. As long as walls were thick enough and the snow was adequately compacted, they rarely failed. The exception was thermal failure. If interior temperature rose enough to cause melting, walls could thin rapidly. The meltwater ran down the wall face, eroding it. If melting continued unchecked, walls could fail within hours. This made heat management critical. A small fire warmed the space adequately, while causing minimal melting. A large fire felt more comfortable but endangered the structure. Builders had to choose between comfort and safety always took precedence. The entrance tunnel served multiple functions beyond access. Its upward angle created a cold trap, but its cold air settled into the tunnel rather than the chamber. This meant the chamber was several degrees warmer than the tunnel, and the tunnel was warmer than outside. This temperature stratification was passive. It required no effort or active heat source. Simple physics, cold air sinking, warm air rising, created the effect automatically. A properly angled tunnel could maintain a 10-degree difference between outside and inside. The tunnel also blocked wind completely. Even if wind somehow entered the tunnel mouth, it would be broken up by the confined space and the upward angle. No wind reached the chamber. This eliminated wind chill entirely, dramatically improving the effective temperature. Ventilation was the most frequently misunderstood aspect of snow shelter construction. Many people assumed that snow, being porous, allowed adequate air exchange. This was incorrect. Compacted snow was nearly airtight. A sealed snow shelter would suffocate its occupant within hours. The ventilation hole was mandatory. It needed to be large enough for continuous air exchange, but small enough to minimize heat loss. An inch-diameter hole was usually sufficient for one person. 2 people required a larger hole or 2 separate holes. The hole's location mattered. Placing it at the highest point of the dome allowed carbon dioxide, which was slightly denser than air, to be displaced upward and out. Placing it too low created dead zones where CO2 accumulated. The hole also needed to remain open. Snow could drift over it during continued storms. Moisture from breathing could freeze in it, gradually closing it. Occupants had to check the ventilation hole periodically and clear it if necessary. The consequences of inadequate ventilation were insidious. Carbon dioxide buildup did not cause immediate distress. It caused gradual drowsiness. A person simply became tired, lay down to sleep, and never woke. Many deaths in snow shelters resulted from blocked or missing ventilation. Moisture dynamics inside snow shelters were complex. Human breath contained water vapor. This vapor was warm when exhaled but cooled as it circulated. When it contacted cold surfaces, walls, ceiling, it condensed or froze, forming frost. This frost layer gradually built up on interior surfaces. It could become quite thick over extended stays, sometimes an inch or more. This actually improved insulation slightly by filling microscopic gaps, but it also indicated moisture being removed from the air, which was beneficial. The frost was delicate. Touching it or bumping the ceiling caused showers of ice crystals to fall. This was harmless but annoying, particularly if the occupant was sleeping. Careful movement inside the shelter minimized disturbance. Meltwater was the enemy of snow shelters. Even small amounts caused problems. Water running down walls eroded them. Water pooling on the floor created wet, cold conditions. Water freezing in the entrance could block escape. Preventing meltwater required vigilant heat management. Temperatures inside had to remain below freezing, ideally in the mid-20s Fahrenheit. This was warm enough to prevent hypothermia with proper insulation, but cold enough to prevent melting. A small fire could be maintained if necessary, but it had to be tiny, just a handful of burning material at a time. The fire was primarily for psychological comfort and minimal warming of hands and face. It could not be relied upon for significant space heating without endangering the structure. Some builders created chimneys for fires. These were narrow vertical shafts carved from the chamber, up through the ceiling. Smoke rose through the shaft and exited above. This allowed slightly larger fires without filling the chamber with smoke. But chimneys were difficult to construct. They required reaching up into the ceiling and carving a narrow, straight passage. The shaft had to be wide enough for smoke flow, but not so wide as to compromise ceiling strength. Most builders omitted chimneys and accepted minimal or no fire. The structural life of a snow shelter was limited. Even without melting, snow sublimated. Water molecules evaporated directly from solid to gas. This was slow at low temperatures, but continuous. Over days or weeks, walls gradually thinned. Additionally, repeated temperature cycles weakened structure. Daytime warming and nighttime cooling caused expansion and contraction. Crystal boundaries shifted. Cohesion decreased. A shelter sound on day 1 might be questionable on day 3. For emergency survival, sheltering through a single storm lasting hours or a few days, these long-term degradation processes were irrelevant. The shelter only needed to last until conditions improved enough for travel. But for extended use, snow shelters required maintenance or rebuilding. The knowledge of these structural principles was not intuitive. It came from experience, observation, and sometimes from fatal mistakes. Each generation of plain settlers built their understanding through trial and error, guided by advice from those who had survived. The physics involved were not discussed in such terms. Builders did not speak of sintering or sublimation, but they understood practically that old drifts were better than fresh ones, that domes were stronger than flat roofs, that heat had to be controlled carefully. This practical knowledge, accumulated and refined, made the difference between shelters that protected life and those that became tombs. It was knowledge that could not be learned from books, only from cold experience on the winter plains. The entrance to a snow shelter was its most vulnerable point. It was the only opening large enough for a person to pass through, which meant it was also the primary route for heat loss and cold air infiltration. Designing and constructing this opening required balancing accessibility with thermal efficiency. The entrance began as a horizontal or slightly upward-angled tunnel cut into the drift face. The angle was critical. A downward angle would allow cold air to pour into the chamber, pooling at the lowest point and making the space uninhabitable. An upward angle created a cold trap, using physics to separate living space from outside conditions. The ideal angle was subtle, perhaps 10 to 15 degrees above horizontal. This was steep enough to prevent cold air flow into the chamber, but shallow enough to allow easy crawling. A person entering or exiting had to be able to move materials through the tunnel, which required reasonable clearance and manageable slope. Tunnel dimensions were constrained by practical concerns. It had to be wide enough for a person wearing bulky winter clothing to pass through. Shoulders were typically the limiting factor. Most tunnels were 20 to 24 inches wide, just enough clearance to avoid constant scraping against walls. Height was minimised to reduce heat loss. Most tunnels were 18 to 22 inches high. This forced crawling on hands and knees, but prevented warm air from escaping easily. A taller tunnel created a chimney effect, pulling warm air out continuously. Length depended on available space and builder preference. A tunnel that was too short offered little thermal protection. Wind could blow directly into the chamber. A tunnel that was too long was exhausting to crawl through and difficult to maintain. 3 to 4 feet was typical. This length created sufficient separation between interior and exterior conditions while remaining manageable. In larger drifts or for extended stays, tunnels might be 6 feet or more, creating a true transitional space. The tunnel floor was kept lower than the chamber floor. This step up at the tunnel's inner end was crucial for thermal management. Cold air, being denser than warm air, flowed downward. The step prevented it from entering the main chamber. Instead, it pulled in the tunnel, creating a buffer zone. The step height varied from 6 inches to 2 feet. A higher step provided better thermal protection, but made entering the chamber more awkward. Builders had to lift themselves up while manoeuvring in confined space. A lower step was easier to negotiate but less effective at blocking cold air. Some builders created a baffle or partial wall just inside the chamber entrance. This L-shaped configuration forced air entering the chamber to turn 90 degrees. This broke up any air currents and provided additional thermal separation. The baffle was simply a thin wall of snow left standing during excavation. The tunnel walls required smooth finishing. Rough surfaces caught on clothing during passage. They also created places where frost could build up, gradually narrowing the passage. A few minutes spent smoothing walls with gloved hands prevented later problems. Particular attention was paid to the tunnel entrance, the point where shelter met storm. This opening faced maximum wind exposure. If positioned poorly, snow could drift over it, blocking exit. If positioned well, natural wind patterns kept it relatively clear. The opening was typically cut on the leeward side of the drift where wind was minimal. However, wind direction could shift during a storm. A tunnel entrance that was sheltered when construction began might face direct wind hours later. Builders had to anticipate this and position openings accordingly. Some builders partially blocked the entrance after crawling inside. They would pack loose snow into the outer portion of the tunnel, leaving only a small gap for air circulation. This reduced heat loss significantly, while maintaining ventilation. The packed snow could be quickly removed if exit became necessary. Others created a door of sorts, a block of snow cut to fit the tunnel entrance. The block was placed loosely in position, not sealed tightly. It blocked wind and reduced heat loss, but could be pushed out easily from inside. This provided security without creating a sealed environment. The danger of sealing was real. A completely blocked entrance combined with inadequate ventilation created a death trap. Carbon dioxide from breathing accumulated. Oxygen levels dropped. The occupant asphyxiated. Many deaths occurred this way, people sealing themselves in too thoroughly in pursuit of warmth. Ventilation was mandatory, not optional. A snow shelter without adequate air exchange was a burial chamber. The ventilation hole served this critical function, and its creation and maintenance were as important as the shelter's structural integrity. The hole was small, typically 1 to 2 inches in diameter. This seemed insufficient, but air moved through it continuously via natural convection. Warm, CO2-rich air rose and exited. Cold, fresh air entered through the entrance tunnel. This circulation was passive and continuous. The hole's location was almost always at the highest point of the chamber, usually the dome's apex. This placed it at the natural collection point for warm air and exhaled gases. A hole placed lower was less effective. Warm air had to be displaced downward against its natural tendency to rise. Creating the hole required careful work. The builder punched a stick, knife or finger upward through the ceiling until it broke through to the outside. The breakthrough was felt as a sudden release of resistance. The tool was then moved in a circular motion to widen the hole to the desired diameter. The exterior opening of the ventilation hole needed to be clear of drifted snow. Sometimes a stick was left protruding upwards to mark the location and keep it from being buried. The stick also allowed checking from inside whether the hole remained open. If the stick could be moved, the passage was clear. Snow accumulation could close ventilation holes gradually. During active storms, snow fell or drifted onto the shelter. Some would settle over the ventilation hole. Inside, moisture from breathing sometimes froze in the hole, slowly constricting it. Both processes had to be monitored. Checking ventilation was done by feel. A hand held near the hole could detect air movement, slight current indicating good circulation. Periodically, clearing the hole with a stick ensured it remained functional. This was particularly important before sleeping, when the occupant would not be conscious to notice breathing difficulty. The consequences of blocked ventilation were not immediately obvious. Carbon dioxide buildup caused drowsiness, but drowsiness was expected in a dark, quiet shelter. The person would attribute their tiredness to exhaustion or boredom, not to suffocation. They would sleep and not wake. This danger made ventilation awareness critical. Experienced survivors checked ventilation holes multiple times during their stay. They cleared them preemptively. They accepted the heat loss from the hole as the price of safety. They never sealed their shelter completely, no matter how cold it became. The entrance tunnel served a secondary ventilation function. Fresh air entered primarily through the tunnel, drawn by the convection current created by warm air exiting through the ceiling hole. This created a circulation pattern. Cold air in low, warm air out high. This pattern was invisible but could be demonstrated with smoke. A small amount of smoke from a fire or smouldering material would rise to the ceiling, flow toward the ventilation hole and exit. This confirmed proper circulation. If smoke lingered or sank, ventilation was inadequate. The balance between ventilation and heat retention was delicate. More ventilation meant a colder but safer shelter. Less ventilation meant a warmer but more dangerous shelter. Builders erred on the side of safety, accepting discomfort to ensure survival. Temperature inside a properly ventilated shelter typically ranged from 20 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on outside temperature and body heat contribution. This was far below normal room temperature, but far above outside conditions during severe cold. More importantly, it was above the threshold for survival with adequate insulation. The entrance and ventilation system required no energy to operate once constructed. It was entirely passive, relying on natural physical processes. This was ideal for an emergency shelter where resources were minimal and conservation was essential. Maintenance was minimal but necessary. The entrance needed to be checked periodically to ensure it remained passable. The ventilation hole needed clearing after heavy snow or if breathing seemed difficult. The tunnel floor needed occasional sweeping to remove snow tracked in on clothing. These simple tasks, performed diligently, kept the shelter functional. Neglecting them invited disaster. A blocked entrance meant no escape. A blocked ventilation hole meant suffocation. The difference between survival and death could be a few minutes spent maintaining critical systems. The psychological aspect of the entrance was also significant. It represented connection to the outside world and the possibility of escape. A person could look down the tunnel and see daylight, proof that the storm would eventually end, that the shelter was temporary. This visibility was comforting. Complete darkness and isolation were psychologically difficult. Being able to see the tunnel entrance, even if exit was currently impossible, provided reassurance. The shelter felt less like a tomb and more like a way station. At night or during heavy snow, the entrance showed nothing but darkness or white. This was the most difficult time psychologically. The occupant had to trust that the storm was still there, that exit would be possible later, that they were not buried beyond escape. Maintaining this trust required mental discipline. The entrance and ventilation system, simple as it was, represented sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics, air circulation, and survival physiology. It was born from generations of Arctic experience, refined by plains necessity, and maintained by careful attention. Without it, snow shelters were uninhabitable. With it, they became functional survival space. The difference was measured in hours of life, hours that could stretch into days if needed, hours that allowed storms to pass and rescue or escape to become possible. Once construction was complete and the builder had crawled inside, the chamber's character became apparent. It was a space defined entirely by absence, snow that had been removed, creating a void where solid material had been. This void, crude and cold, was now shelter. The dimensions were intimate. Most chambers measured roughly 6 feet long, 3 to 4 feet wide, and 3 feet high at the centre. This was barely enough room for an adult to lie down with bent knees, to sit upright, to shift position. It was not spacious, it was minimal. But minimal was sufficient. The purpose was survival, not comfort. The space needed only to contain a body, protect it from wind, and provide insulation from lethal cold. These requirements were met. Anything more would have required longer excavation and larger drifts. The walls curved smoothly from floor to ceiling, following the natural shape of the excavation. They were not vertical like room walls. Instead, they sloped inward, meeting at the domed ceiling. This gave the space a cave-like quality, enclosed and organic rather than architectural. The surface of the walls was textured. Even after smoothing, small irregularities remained, places where snow had broken unevenly, where ice chunks had been pried out, where the scraping tool had left marks. These textures caught what little light was available, creating subtle patterns of shadow and highlight. The colour was not pure white. Compacted snow appeared bluish in most light, sometimes with hints of grey or translucent areas where ice predominated. The blue tint came from the way snow crystals scattered light, absorbing red wavelengths and reflecting blue. This gave the entire space a cold, otherworldly cast. Temperature inside was measurably warmer than outside, but still well below freezing. If outside air was 30 below zero, inside might be 10 below. If outside was zero, inside might be 15 or 20 above. The difference was survival critical, but not comfortable. The floor was the coldest surface because cold air settled there. Despite efforts to level it during construction, slight irregularities remained. These became apparent only when lying down, a small rise pressing into the shoulder, a depression under the hip. Adjusting position helped, but perfect comfort was impossible. Most builders placed whatever insulation they had on the floor. Straw was ideal, dry, compressible, insulating. A layer several inches thick transformed the floor from barely tolerable to acceptable. Hay worked similarly, though it was less effective when damp. Buffalo robes were highly prized as floor covering. The thick fur provided both insulation and cushioning. A single robe could make the difference between a sleepless night of shivering and actual rest. Those fortunate enough to possess robes treated them carefully, keeping them dry and clean. Blankets served similar purposes but were less effective. Wool blankets retained some insulating value even when damp from breath moisture. Cotton blankets became useless when wet and could actually increase heat loss. Most settlers knew this and avoided cotton in winter conditions. Additional clothing was layered on the floor when available. Extra coats, spare pants, even as burlap sacks. Anything that created a barrier between body and frozen ground. These layers compressed under body weight but still provided more insulation than bare snow. The ceiling curved overhead, close enough to touch while sitting. Its surface was smooth, shaped during excavation into a continuous dome. Frost formed on it almost immediately as moisture from breathing condensed on the cold surface. This frost layer gradually thickened. It appeared as delicate crystalline formations, white against the blue-grey snow. In dim light from the entrance, it sparkled faintly. The beauty was incidental. The frost was simply physics. Water molecules freezing onto any surface below 32 degrees. The frost was fragile. Any bump or vibration dislodged crystals which fell as fine snow. This was harmless but constant. The occupant learned to move carefully, minimizing disturbance. Sudden movements resulted in a shower of ice crystals, unpleasant if one was trying to sleep. Sound inside the chamber was peculiar. The snow walls absorbed most frequencies, creating unusual acoustics. Normal speaking voice sounded muffled and close. Breathing was clearly audible, one's own breath, and if another person was present, theirs as well. Outside sounds were nearly inaudible. The howling wind that dominated the open prairie was reduced to a distant, barely perceptible rumble. This was one of the shelter's most striking features, the sudden transition from deafening wind to profound quiet. This quiet was both blessing and curse. It allowed rest and reduced psychological stress from constant wind noise. But it also created sensory deprivation. In absolute quiet, small sounds became magnified. The rustle of clothing seemed loud, A stomach growl was clearly audible. The sound of one's own heartbeat could be heard in the silence. Light conditions varied by time and weather. During clear daylight, a blue-white glow filtered through the snow walls and ceiling. This was dim but sufficient to see clearly. Within the chamber, objects were visible, details discernible, reading theoretically possible though tiring to the eyes. The entrance tunnel admitted more direct light. Looking toward the entrance showed a brighter opening, though even this was subdued by the tunnel's length and the diffuse quality of stormlight. During heavy snow, this opening appeared as a lighter grey against the chamber's deeper grey. At night, darkness was nearly complete. What little starlight or moonlight might penetrate snow was insufficient for vision. The chamber became a place of absolute darkness, where a hand held inches from the face was invisible. This darkness was disorienting initially. A small fire changed everything. Even a flame the size of a thumb cast enough light to see the entire chamber. The flickering orange glow warmed not just the air, but the psychological atmosphere. Fire represented human presence, control, defiance of the cold. But fire was dangerous. The flame's heat radiated to nearby surfaces. Snow began melting where heat struck directly. Water droplets formed, ran down walls, created wet patches. If the fire burned too long or too hot, structural damage occurred. Most fires in snow shelters were tiny. A handful of dry grass or hay, a few splinters of wood if available, perhaps buffalo chips. These burned for only a few minutes, providing brief warmth and light before being extinguished or allowed to burn out. The smoke from these small fires was problematic. It filled the chamber quickly despite the ventilation hole. The occupant had to lie flat, face near the floor where air remained clearer. Sitting upright meant breathing smoke directly. This made any fire a trade-off between warmth and breathability. Some builders created fire pits, shallow depressions in the floor where burning material could be contained. The pit captured ashes and created a defined zone for heat. It also placed the flame slightly below normal breathing level, reducing smoke inhalation somewhat. Others accepted that fire was more trouble than benefit. They relied entirely on body heat and insulation, never lighting flames inside the shelter. This eliminated the risks of melting and smoke, but required excellent clothing and bedding to prevent hypothermia. The decision depended on circumstances. A person with good robes or blankets could survive without fire. A person with inadequate insulation needed fire's warmth despite the problems it created. There was no universal solution, only situational judgment. Water was sometimes needed during extended stays. Melting snow was the only source. This required heat, which meant a small fire or prolonged exposure to body heat. A container, a pot, cup, even a folded piece of cloth was filled with snow and held near the fire or against the body. Snow melted slowly. It took significant heat to convert solid to liquid. A cup of snow yielded only about a third of a cup of water because snow was mostly air. Multiple rounds of melting were needed to obtain adequate water for drinking. The process was tedious and energy intensive. It required fuel for fire, time for fire melting, and generated moisture that increased frost formation. Many occupants simply ate snow, though this cooled the body and required energy to melt internally. Neither option was ideal. Personal belongings occupied minimal space. Most people carried little when travelling in winter, perhaps a knife, matches wrapped in oilcloth, a small supply of food, extra mittens or a scarf. These items were kept within arm's reach, often inside clothing for warmth. Food carried in winter was typically preserved goods. Dried meat, hardtack, perhaps a small amount of sugar or coffee. These were eaten sparingly. Cold suppressed appetite somewhat, and conserving supplies was prudent when duration of confinement was uncertain. Eating inside the shelter was uncomfortable. Food was frozen solid. It had to be warmed in hands or inside clothing before it could be chewed. Even then it was difficult to eat, hard, tasteless from cold, requiring significant jaw work. But it provided calories, and calories were survival. The psychological experience of the interior space was complex. It was simultaneously protective and confining, safe and threatening. The walls that blocked wind also closed in. The ceiling that sheltered also pressed down. Many people felt claustrophobic initially. This feeling passed or was suppressed by the necessity. The alternative to being inside was being outside, which meant death. The The shelter might be uncomfortable, but it was life. This realization made the space tolerable, even preferable. Time moved strangely in the chamber. Without sunlight, clocks, or activities, hours blurred together. A person might think they had rested only a short while, only to emerge and find half a day had passed. Or they might feel certain many hours had elapsed, when barely one had. This temporal distortion was worsened by the darkness and quiet. The normal cues that mark time's passage, shadows moving, counts of daily activity, meals at regular intervals, were absent. The occupant drifted in a timeless space, anchored only by the knowledge that eventually the storm would end. The interior space of a snow shelter was not designed for human comfort. It was designed by necessity for human survival. It met that purpose adequately. People entered it desperate and emerged alive. In the harsh calculus of Plains winter, that was sufficient. The floor of a snow shelter was the foundation of survival. A person would spend hours or days lying on it, sitting on it, sleeping on it. The quality of this surface directly affected their ability to maintain body heat and therefore their chances of living through the storm. Unimproved, the floor was simply compacted snow. It was frozen solid, flat where the builder had scraped it level, but still snow. Contact with it drew heat from the body rapidly. Prolonged contact would cause hypothermia, even with clothing, because the temperature differential was too great. The physics were straightforward. Human body temperature was 98 degrees. Floor temperature was perhaps 20 degrees, possibly lower. This 70-degree difference drove heat transfer. The body tried to warm the floor. The floor absorbed that heat endlessly, never warming, always drawing more. The solution was insulation, materials placed between body and floor that slowed heat transfer. These materials had to trap air in small pockets, creating dead air space. Moving air conducted heat away, trapped air insulated. Straw was the preferred material when available. It consisted of hollow stems from wheat, oats, or other grain crops. Each stem was a tube filled with air. Thousands of these tubes, compressed slightly under body weight, created an effective insulating layer. A bundle of straw, perhaps 6 inches thick when loose, compressed to 2 or 3 inches under a person's weight. This compressed layer still retained numerous air pockets. It also had enough spring to provide minimal cushioning, making the floor somewhat less brutally hard. Gathering straw in advance of winter travel was prudent. A bundle could be tied with twine and carried easily. It weighed little and compressed significantly for transport. Those planning winter journeys often prepared such bundles specifically for emergency use, but not everyone carried straw. It was bulky and many trips were undertaken without planning for disaster. People were caught unexpectedly, or they miscalculated their risk, or they simply gambled on reaching their destination. These people had to improvise floor insulation from whatever they possessed. Hay served as an alternative. It was coarser than straw, consisting of entire grass plants rather than just stems. It compressed more under weight and lost insulating value when damp, but it was better than nothing and was sometimes more readily available. Prairie grass itself could be used if accessible. During a blizzard, reaching outside to pull grass was dangerous, but sometimes grass could be found in the drift itself, buried by previous snows before winter fully set in. This grass was frozen, but could be spread on the floor in thick layers. The grass had to be worked loose from its frozen state. It was brittle and broke apart, but the pieces still provided some insulation. A layer 8 to 10 inches thick of prairie grass fragments was roughly equivalent to 3 inches of good straw. Buffalo robes were the luxury option. These were the tanned hides of bison, fur side intact. A single robe measured perhaps 6 by 8 feet when spread flat. The fur was dense, the hide was thick, and the insulation value was exceptional. A person with a buffalo robe could lie on it fur side down, gaining insulation from both the hide and the trapped air in the fur. They could also pull part of the robe over themselves as a blanket. This dual use made robes extremely valuable in winter survival situations. However, buffalo robes were expensive and heavy. By the 1880s, buffalo were nearly extinct, making robes rare. Most settlers did not own them. Those who did often kept them at home rather than carrying them on trips. So while ideal, robes were usually unavailable. Blankets filled the middle ground. Wool blankets were common settler possessions. A family might own 2 or 3. Travellers often carried one blanket rolled and tied to their saddle or wagon. These blankets served multiple purposes. warmth at night, shelter from sun, emergency floor insulation. Wool maintained insulating properties even when damp from breath moisture or snow. The crimped structure of wool fibres trapped air effectively. A wool blanket folded double created a floor covering that significantly reduced heat loss. Cotton blankets were less effective. They provided some insulation when dry, but collapsed when damp. Moisture made them thermally conductive rather than insulating. A wet cotton blanket could actually increase heat loss compared to bare snow. Additional clothing became floor insulation when nothing else was available. A person might remove their coat and lie on it, accepting cold to their upper body in exchange for insulation beneath. Extra pants, spare shirts, even woolen underwear, all could be layered on the floor. This created a dilemma. The clothing provided insulation but was needed for wearing. Removing it to lie on it meant exposing the body to cold air. The calculation was complex, which created less heat loss, wearing the clothing or lying on it. Generally, lying on insulation was more critical than wearing extra layers above. The floor contact area was large and constant. Heat loss there was continuous and severe. Upper body heat loss could be reduced by curling up, pulling knees to chest, minimizing exposed surface area. So the typical solution was to layer everything available on the floor. All spare clothing, blankets, any fabric or hide, even leather goods like harnesses or saddle blankets if present. This created a padded area where the person would rest. The insulation was arranged carefully. Thickest materials went on bottom, closest to the snow. Softer materials went on top, nearest the body. This layering maximized both insulation and minimal comfort. The goal was to create a nest, a defined space where body heat could be conserved. The nest was typically body-sized. There was no point insulating the entire floor. That wasted materials. Instead, the insulation covered just the area where the person would lie. This concentrated all available materials in one place for maximum effect. Edges of the insulated area were tucked or weighted down to prevent shifting. Nothing was more frustrating than carefully arranging a bed only to have it disarranged during the night. Corners were tucked under adjacent materials or pinned with snow chunks to hold them in place. Once arranged, the floor bed was tested. The builder would lie down briefly, assessing comfort and cold penetration. Cold spots indicated gaps in insulation, places where materials had separated or were too thin. Additional material was added to these areas. The test also revealed pressure points. The hip bone pressed hard against insulation. The shoulder blade did likewise. These high-pressure areas compressed insulation, reducing its effectiveness. Adding extra thickness at these points helped distribute pressure and maintain insulation. Some builders created a raised platform, a bench of snow left standing during excavation. This platform was perhaps 6 inches high and wide enough to lie on. It served as a base for insulation, raising the sleeping surface above the coldest floor-level air. The platform required planning during excavation. It meant removing less snow in one area, leaving a flat-topped ridge. This reduced chamber volume slightly, but improved sleeping conditions significantly. The elevated bed was a mark of experience, something thought of in advance rather than improvised later. Whether on a platform or directly on floor level, the insulated bed became the survival center. This was where the occupant would spend most of their time. Getting it right was essential. Poor floor preparation meant cold, sleeplessness, and accelerated hypothermia. Good preparation meant relative comfort and sustainable conditions. The preparation process took perhaps 15 to 30 minutes. This was time well spent. The temptation was to hurry to get inside, close the entrance, and rest immediately. But those who took time to prepare properly fared far better than those who did not. Once satisfied with the floor, the builder gathered remaining materials. Food was placed within easy reach. Water container, if any, was positioned near where fire would be made. Tools were set aside but accessible. Everything was organized to minimize movement later. Minimal movement was important because the chamber was small and the ceiling was low. Every motion risked bumping walls or ceiling, dislodging frost showers. Every reach stretched muscles and disturbed insulation. The more that could be accomplished in the setup phase, the less would be needed later. The floor preparation was complete when the builder could lie down comfortably enough to rest, when cold penetration was reduced to tolerable levels, when the space felt as prepared as possible given available materials. This moment marked a transition. Construction was finished. The shelter existed. The floor was prepared. What remained was waiting, enduring however many hours or days the storm continued, maintaining the space, conserving energy and body heat, and ultimately surviving to emerge when conditions improved. The quality of the floor preparation influenced every subsequent hour. A good floor allowed actual sleep, which conserved energy and maintained mental state. A poor floor meant constant discomfort, fitful rest, declining physical condition. The difference accumulated over time and could determine outcome. So these minutes spent arranging straw, positioning blankets, testing and adjusting. They were among the most important of the entire ordeal. They set the conditions under which a survival would be attempted. They were preparation in its most literal sense, making ready for what was to come. Fire inside a snow shelter presented an acute paradox. It was desperately desired for warmth and light, for psychological comfort and minimal cooking capacity, yet it threatened the very structure that made survival possible. Managing this contradiction required constant vigilance and difficult choices. The fundamental problem was straightforward. Fire generated heat. Heat melted snow. The shelter was made entirely of snow. Therefore, fire gradually destroyed the shelter. This progression was inevitable. The only question was how quickly it occurred. The melting began wherever flames or hot air contacted snow surfaces directly. The ceiling above a fire showed effects first. Heat rose naturally, concentrating at the highest point. Snow there began to glisten as its surface approached melting temperature. Then small drops formed, then steady dripping began. Each drop represented structural loss. The ceiling was thinning. If melting continued, the thinned area would weaken. Eventually it would collapse, dumping accumulated snow onto the fire and occupant below. This had killed people. Sudden collapse, burying them or blocking the entrance. Walls melted more slowly because they received less direct heat, but they were not immune. Radiant heat from flames warmed them. Warm air circulating in the thick chamber gradually raised overall temperature. If interior temperature rose above freezing, all surfaces began melting simultaneously. The water produced by melting created additional problems beyond structural weakening. It ran down walls in rivulets, pooling on the floor. These pools froze when fire was extinguished, creating ice patches. The ice was slippery and thermally conductive. Lying on it drew heat rapidly from the body. Water soaked into any fabric or organic materials on the floor. Blankets became damp. Straw absorbed water and lost insulating properties. Clothing grew wet. All of these effects reduced the occupant's ability to stay warm, ironically making the space colder despite the fire's presence. Smoke was another complication. Burning materials produced smoke that had to go somewhere. The ventilation hole provided some escape route, but it was small. Smoke filled the chamber quickly, especially if the fire was producing more smoke than the ventilation could clear. Smoke hung in layers based on temperature and density. The hottest smoke rose to the ceiling. Cooler smoke settled lower. The occupant had to position themselves in the clearest zone, usually low near the floor. Sitting upright meant breathing smoke directly, causing coughing and eye irritation. Different fuels produced different amounts of smoke. Dry grass and straw burned relatively clean when flames were strong but smoked heavily when smouldering. Wood, when available, burned cleaner but was rarely available on the plains. Buffalo chips varied, dry ones burned acceptably, damp ones were unusable. The amount of fuel determined fire size, which determined all subsequent effects. A tiny fire, just a handful of material burning for a few minutes, caused minimal melting and smoke. A larger fire provided more warmth but accelerated problems. The balance was delicate. Most experienced builders limited fires to the absolute minimum. They would gather combustible material into a small pile, perhaps a double handful. They would light it and let it burn completely, which took 5 to 10 minutes. During this time they warmed their hands, perhaps heated a small amount of water, and gained psychological benefit from the flame. Then the fire was allowed to die. No more fuel was added. The embers faded, heat dissipated, and conditions returned to cold stasis. This cycle might be repeated 2 or 3 times during a long stay, but no more. Each fire was a calculated risk against the shelter's structural integrity. The decision of whether to have any fire at all was agonizing. A person already cold from exposure, exhausted from excavation, facing hours or days of confinement, they wanted fire desperately. The desire was not just physical but psychological. Fire was hope, agency, human control over nature. But the experienced survivor understood the cost. They had heard stories or witnessed firsthand what happened when shelters melted. They knew that temporary warmth could lead to permanent disaster, so they often chose to endure cold rather than risk fire. This choice was easier if they had adequate insulation. A person with good blankets and robes could survive without fire, though uncomfortably. A person with minimal insulation faced a harder choice: freeze slowly without fire, or risk shelter failure with fire. There was no correct answer that applied universally. Each situation required individual judgment. Factors included outside temperature, expected storm duration, quality of insulation, structural soundness of the shelter, and the person's physical condition. Someone already hypothermic might need fire immediately to prevent further cooling, but they also needed shelter to last. The fire had to be tiny and brief, just enough to raise core temperature slightly without compromising structure. This required precise control, which was difficult when hands were numb and thinking was impaired. Someone in good condition with adequate insulation might forgo fire entirely. They would simply wrap themselves in blankets, curl into a compact position, and wait. Body heat alone, retained by insulation and protected from wind, was sufficient for survival at moderately low temperatures. The temperature threshold where fire became necessary rather than optional was roughly -20 Fahrenheit inside the shelter. Above that temperature, good insulation was sufficient. Below it, some external heat source was needed to prevent hypothermia over extended periods. Inside shelter temperature depended on outside conditions. If outside was -40, inside might be -10 even with body heat. This was below the survival threshold without fire. But if outside was 0, inside might be 20, cold but survivable with proper preparation. So the fire decision often came down to luck. The luck of how cold the storm was, of how much insulation was available, of how well the shelter was constructed. Good luck meant survival without fear. Bad luck meant needing fire and accepting its risks. When fire was necessary, placement mattered enormously. The fire had to be positioned to minimize ceiling damage while maximizing heat efficiency. This usually meant placing it slightly off-center, not directly below the dome's highest point. A small depression was scraped in the floor to contain the fire. This pit was perhaps 6 inches in diameter and 2 inches deep, just enough to hold burning material and catch ashes. The pit was positioned where the person could tend the fire while lying down, because sitting up meant breathing smoke. Fuel was prepared in advance. Every scrap of combustible material was gathered and organized by type. The driest, fastest burning material was separated for use as tinder. Slower burning material was set aside for sustaining flames once started. Everything was kept as dry as possible. Ignition was done with matches if available. Matches were precious in winter travel, kept dry in oilcloth or a tin container, counted carefully, used only when necessary. A person might carry 20 matches and consider themselves well supplied. Losing them meant losing fire capability entirely. Without matches, fire starting became extremely difficult. Flint and steel could work but required dry tinder and considerable skill. In confined, cold, dark conditions with numb hands, starting fire without matches was nearly impossible. Many people simply could not do it. This made fire a limited resource. If a person had 10 matches, they could have at most 10 fires. If each fire required 2 matches due to wind or damp conditions, they could have 5 fires. The mathematics was stark. Fire was finite. Storms could last days. Every fire had to count. The typical fire lighting sequence began with preparing the pit and arranging tinder. Tinder might be dried grass pulled apart into fine strands, shaved wood splinters if available, or bits of fabric from clothing. This was formed into a small loose pile that would catch flame easily. A match was struck against its box. In cold conditions, matches sometimes failed. The chemical head crumbled or the wood snapped. This was why 2 matches were often needed. The first might fail, requiring a second attempt. When flame caught on the match, it was immediately lowered to the tinder. The The tinder had to ignite before the match burned down, which gave perhaps 5 to 10 seconds. If tinder did not catch, the match was wasted, and another attempt was needed. Once tinder was burning, slightly larger material was added carefully. Adding too much smothered the flame. Adding too slowly let the flame die before it established. The process required attention and practice, building fire intensity gradually from spark to small flame to sustained burn. The small fire burned for its brief lifespan. During this time, the occupant held their hands near the flame in warming fingers and palms. This warmth was intense relief after hours of cold. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical warmth. Some used the fire to melt snow for water. A metal cup or pot was held at the flame's edge, filled with snow. The snow melted slowly. Multiple fillings were needed to obtain even a small amount of water. The process was tedious but sometimes necessary. Others heated small amounts of food. A piece of dried meat held near flames softened slightly, making it easier to chew. This was a marginal improvement but welcome. Food was more digestible when not frozen solid, and easier to eat meant more calories consumed. As fuel was exhausted, flames diminished. They shrank from hand height to finger height to candle height to nothing. Embers glowed briefly, then faded. The light died. Darkness returned. Cold reasserted itself gradually as the heat dissipated. The entire cycle from lighting to extinction took perhaps 10 to 15 minutes. During that time, the chamber temperature might rise by 5 or 10 degrees. After extinction, temperature gradually fell back to its baseline. The net effect was temporary warmth at the cost of some structural integrity and one match. Whether this trade-off was worthwhile depended on need. Sometimes it was essential, the difference between maintaining core temperature and sliding into hypothermia. Other times it was arguably unnecessary, a comfort rather than survival requirement. The person had to judge in the moment. What was never acceptable was careless fire. A fire left unattended, allowed to grow too large, fed continuously without regard for consequences. This was suicide. The shelter would fail, leaving the person exposed at the storm's worst moment. Many deaths occurred this way, warmth pursued to the point of destruction. So fire in snow shelters was always minimal, always brief, always calculated. It was a tool used sparingly with full awareness of costs. It provided moments of warmth in hours of cold, brief light in extended darkness. It was never abundant, never casual, ever taken for granted. The alternative, no fire at all, was what most survivors actually experienced. They endured the cold through insulation and body heat alone. They waited in darkness except for faint daylight filtering through snow. They accepted discomfort as the price of safety. This acceptance marked the difference between those who understood snow shelters and those who did not. The shelter was not a warm refuge. It was a cold refuge, a place where cold was merely survivable rather than lethal. Fire could not change this fundamental reality without destroying the shelter itself. Understanding this limitation, accepting it, and surviving despite it, that was the skill that mattered. Fire was an option, sometimes necessary, but always dangerous. The real survival tool was the shelter itself, and the shelter required cold to remain intact. The acoustic environment inside a snow shelter was unlike any space most people had experienced. It combined elements of profound quiet with occasional sharp sounds, creating a sensory world that was both peaceful and unsettling. The quiet came from snow's sound-absorbing properties. The walls, several feet thick, were composed of millions of ice crystals with air gaps between them. This structure trapped sound waves, preventing them from reflecting. Sounds that entered the walls were absorbed rather than echoed. Outside, the blizzard raged with howling wind that would have been deafening in the open. Wind speeds of 40 or 50 miles per hour across open prairie created a roar that made conversation impossible, that filled the ears completely, that became oppressive through its constancy. But inside the shelter, that roar was reduced to a distant muffled rumble. It was present but subdued, more felt than heard, a low-frequency vibration that indicated the storm's presence without dominating the acoustic space. The transformation was remarkable. This sound reduction was not uniform across frequencies. High-frequency sounds, voices, scraping, crackling, were absorbed most effectively. Low-frequency sounds, Deep wind rumbles, distant thunder if present, penetrated more readily. This created an unusual soundscape where bass tones persisted while treble tones vanished. The result was that the occupant's own breathing became clearly audible. Each inhalation and exhalation could be heard distinctly. In the profound quiet, this sound became almost loud, a rhythmic whisper that marked time and confirmed continued life. Heartbeat was sometimes audible in the silence. Lying still, pressing an ear against insulation or snow, a person could hear their own pulse. This internal sound, normally masked by environmental noise, became noticeable. Some found it reassuring, proof of life continuing. Others found it unsettling, too intimate, too internal. Any movement produced sound that seemed amplified by the quiet. Shifting position created rustling from clothing and insulation. Rolling over produced a series of small sounds. Fabric against fabric, body against bedding, compressed air escaping from insulation. These sounds were ordinary but seemed loud in context. Touching the walls produced various sounds depending on how and where contact occurred. A gloved hand brushing smooth snow made a woosa, soft sliding whisper. A finger scraping frost created a faint scratching. Bumping the ceiling with head or shoulder produced a dull thud followed by the soft cascade of dislodged frost crystals falling. These frost falls created their own particular sound, a gentle pattering like fine sand dropping onto fabric. Each crystal was tiny, but thousands falling together made an audible shower. This happened frequently because any vibration dislodged the delicate frost layer. Fire, when present, introduced a complex set of sounds. Ignition of a tinder produced brief crackling. Flames consuming dry grass or straw created rapid, irregular popping. Heavier materials like wood or buffalo chips produced slower, deeper crackling with occasional snaps as moisture pockets heated and burst. The sound of fire was psychologically significant beyond its acoustic qualities. It was an active, dynamic sound in an otherwise static environment. It represented human agency, warmth, and light. Many people found the crackling comforting simply because it broke the oppressive quiet. After fire died, silence returned, seeming deeper by contrast. The absence of flame sound was noticeable. The quiet reasserted itself, now carrying awareness of what had briefly interrupted it. This post-fire silence was when the space felt most tomb-like. Melting snow, when it occurred, produced distinctive sounds. The first was a faint hissing as solid snow began transitioning to liquid at the surface. Then came the formation of water drops, each one growing, swelling, finally detaching with a tiny plop. These drops fell onto floor or bedding, each impact audible in the quiet. Steady dripping created rhythm. If ceiling melting was occurring, drops fell at intervals, perhaps one every few seconds. This created a temporal marker, a clock of sorts. Long-term occupants reported using drip patterns to estimate time passage when other cues were absent. Voice carried strangely in the enclosed space. Speaking in a normal tone produced sound that seemed both loud and muffled. Loud because it was the only sound, muffled because walls absorbed it. Shouting was rarely necessary since the space was so small, but if someone did shout, the sound was dampened quickly. If two people shared a shelter, their conversation created the dominant sound environment. Words were clearly audible even when whispered. The acoustic intimacy was unusual. There was no background noise to mask conversation, no distance to reduce volume. Everything said was clearly heard. This could be comforting or awkward, depending on relationship and circumstances. Family members or close companions might find the enforced intimacy acceptable. Strangers sharing emergency shelter sometimes found the acoustic closeness uncomfortable. There was no privacy, no escape from another person's sounds. Breathing patterns of others became familiar quickly. A person could distinguish another's inhalation from exhalation, could detect sleep. Breathing versus waking breathing could notice changes in rhythm that indicated discomfort or cold. This awareness was automatic and continuous. Snoring, if it occurred, dominated the acoustic space completely. The sound filled the chamber, reflecting off walls surrounding the listener. There was no escaping it. Some people in shared shelters accepted this as unavoidable. Others found it maddening, though complaining accomplished nothing. The sounds of the body became prominent. Stomach growling was clearly audible. Joints cracking when position shifted produced distinct pops. Swallowing was audible. These normally private sounds became public in the intimate acoustic space. Most people simply accepted this. Modesty about bodily sounds was a luxury that survival situations did not permit. Outside sounds occasionally penetrated. If the storm included thunder, which sometimes occurred in winter storms, the sound reached the shelter as a deep, distant rumble. If snow was falling heavily, sometimes a mass of it would slide off the drift surface above, creating a muffled thump. These outside sounds provided information about conditions. A sudden increase in wind sound meant the storm was intensifying. A decrease suggested it might be abating. Complete silence outside indicated either deep night or possibly that the storm had passed. These cues were valuable for planning emergence. The acoustic isolation was psychologically complex. On one hand, it was peaceful. The absence of wind noise was enormous relief after hours of exposure. The quiet allowed rest, reduced stress, permitted actual sleep despite cold and discomfort. On the other hand, it was alienating. The profound silence created a sense of disconnection from the world. Sounds that normally oriented a person in time and space, animal calls, wind and grass, distant human activity, were absent. The occupant existed in an acoustic void. This void could trigger disorientation, particularly during extended stays. Without sound cues to mark time passage, without acoustic connection to the outside world, people sometimes lost sense of how long they had been sheltering. Hours felt like days or days like hours. The silence also amplified internal mental states. In a noisy environment, thoughts competed with external stimuli. In profound quiet, thoughts had no competition. They became louder internally, more persistent, harder to escape. Some found this meditative, others found it oppressive. Anxiety manifested acoustically. Anxious breathing became rapid and shallow, clearly audible in the quiet. This created a feedback loop. Hearing one's own anxious breathing increased anxiety, which changed breathing further. Conscious breath control was necessary to break this cycle. Sleep brought relief from acoustic awareness. Unconsciousness meant no longer noticing the silence, no longer monitoring every small sound, no longer waiting for sounds that indicated danger or change. Sleep was escape from the acoustic environment as much as from cold and boredom, but sleep also created vulnerability. A person sleeping alone might not hear warning sounds, accelerated dripping indicating dangerous melting, rumbling indicating drift settling or potential collapse, changes in wind suggesting storm ending. This created tension between need for rest and need for vigilance. Some people developed a half-sleeping state where they remained partially aware of sounds while resting. This was not deep restorative sleep, but was better than nothing. They could rest while still monitoring the acoustic environment for important changes. Emerging from the shelter after extended time inside created acoustic shock. Opening the entrance exposed the occupant to full storm sound, or, if the storm had passed, to the vast silence of snow-covered plains. Either way, the contrast was startling after hours in the dampened acoustic environment. The sound environment of snow shelters was part of what made them psychologically difficult despite being physically adequate. The profound quiet, the acoustic intimacy, the isolation from normal sound cues, all of these challenged mental state in ways that cold and discomfort did not. Those who survived longest in snow shelters were often those who made peace with the silence. They accepted it rather than fighting it, used it for rest rather than fearing it. They understood that the absence of sound was itself information. It meant the shelter was intact, sealed against wind, providing the acoustic isolation that came with physical protection. The silence was not emptiness. It was fullness of a different kind, full of absence, full of potential sounds that did not occur, full of the occupant's own presence made audible. Learning to exist in that fullness required adjustment, but for those who managed it, the silence became neutral or even welcome. It was the sound of survival, the acoustic signature of a space between a person and death, maintained by walls of frozen water that absorbed the storm's howl and created a pocket of quiet where life could persist. Light inside a snow shelter followed patterns determined by sun position, storm intensity, and the thickness of surrounding snow. These patterns created a cycle of visibility that shaped activity and psychology throughout a stay. During clear daylight with no active snowfall, light penetrated the snow walls and ceiling with surprising effectiveness. Snow was translucent rather than transparent. Light passed through but was scattered by ice crystals, emerging as a diffuse blue-white glow rather than directional rays. This glow was dim by normal standards. It was perhaps equivalent to deep twilight or the light in a forest on an overcast day, but it was sufficient for seeing clearly within the chamber. Objects were visible, hands could be seen moving, faces were distinguishable if another person was present. The light quality was distinctive. It lacked shadows because it came from all directions simultaneously. Every illuminated snow surface emitted scattered light. This shadowless quality made depth perception difficult. Distances within the small chamber seemed ambiguous, requiring touch to confirm what vision suggested. The blue tint came from how ice crystals scattered light. Longer wavelengths, reds and yellows, were absorbed more readily than shorter wavelengths, blues and violets. This selective filtering gave the interior a cold, otherworldly colour that matched its temperature. As the day progressed, interior light levels changed with sun angle. Morning brought gradual brightening as the sun rose. Midday, when the sun was highest, provided maximum illumination. Afternoon saw slow dimming. These changes were subtle but noticeable over hours. The direction of brightest light indicated sun position. Even though direct sunlight did not penetrate, the walls and ceiling on the sun-facing side glowed slightly brighter. This provided a rough compass orientation and confirmed time passage, both valuable pieces of information. During active snowfall or blizzard conditions, exterior light was reduced. Heavy snow blocked sunlight before it could reach the shelter. The interior darkened noticeably. What had been dim visibility became twilight gloom. This change indicated storm intensity. Darkness meant heavy snow or night approaching. The entrance tunnel admitted more light than the walls because it was a direct opening. Looking toward the entrance from inside the chamber showed a brighter area, sometimes almost startlingly bright by comparison. This served as a reference point and a reminder that the outside world still existed. At night, darkness inside the shelter was absolute. Without fire, there was no light whatsoever. Starlight or moonlight did not penetrate sufficiently to illuminate anything. A person could not see their hand held inches from their face. This darkness was total and disorienting. The transition from dim daylight to full darkness occurred gradually at sunset, then suddenly as the last twilight faded. The occupant watched the already dim space grow dimmer, then cross a threshold where visibility simply ended. This moment marked the beginning of a long night. Night hours passed in complete darkness unless fire was lit. Time became impossible to judge. A person might lie awake for what felt like hours, only to find when dawn came that barely 2 hours had passed. Or they might sleep what seemed briefly, only to wake to morning light after 8 hours. This temporal confusion was psychologically difficult. Humans rely on light cues to regulate circadian rhythms and judge time passage. Without these cues, the internal clock drifted. Sleep patterns disrupted. Estimates of how long one had been sheltering became unreliable. A small fire transformed the visual environment completely. Even a flame the size of a thumb cast enough light to see the entire chamber clearly. The flickering orange glow revealed all textures, made frost crystals sparkle, cast moving shadows despite the shadowless daylight. Firelight was warm, coloured. Oranges, yellows, reds, in stark contrast to the cold blue of filtered daylight. This colour shift had psychological impact. The space felt warmer even before temperature actually rose, simply because warm colours suggested warmth to the brain. But firelight was brief. Most fires lasted only minutes. When flames died, darkness returned suddenly. Eyes that had adjusted to bright firelight were temporarily blind. Several minutes passed before night vision recovered enough to detect the faint blue glow if daylight was still present outside. This cycle, darkness, brief illumination, sudden darkness again, was disorienting. Each lighting felt like a small dawn. Each extinction felt like nightfall. If fires were lit multiple times during actual night hours, the occupant lost all sense of whether it was truly night or day outside. The duration of darkness was one of the greatest psychological challenges. 16 hours of winter darkness was not uncommon at northern latitudes. This meant 16 hours of absolute dark inside the shelter. with only brief fire-lit intervals if the person chose to light fires and had fuel to spare. Human psychology is not adapted to extended darkness while conscious. People naturally sleep during dark hours, but sleeping 16 hours was rarely possible even in the most comfortable conditions. In a cold, uncomfortable snow shelter, sleep came in fitches, an hour here, 2 hours there, with long wakeful periods between. During these wakeful dark hours, there was nothing to do, no reading was possible, there was no light. No tasks could be performed, there was nothing to see. The person simply lay in darkness, waiting for sleep or dawn, whichever came first. Thoughts became the only activity. With no sensory input except cold discomfort and the sound of one's own breathing, the mind turned inward. Some people found this meditative. They used the darkness for reflection, memory review, mental planning for what they would do when the storm passed. Others found it oppressive. Thoughts spiraled into anxiety or fear. Darkness amplified worries about whether the shelter would hold, whether ventilation was adequate, whether the storm would ever end. Without visual distraction, these thoughts dominated consciousness. Counting became a common activity. People counted breaths, counted heartbeats, counted to high numbers simply to occupy the mind. This gave structure to otherwise formless time. Reaching 1,000 counted breaths became a milestone, something achieved in the darkness. Some people talked to themselves or sang quietly. The sound of their own voice was company of a sort, and it confirmed their continued existence. Songs learned in childhood came back, often incomplete but familiar enough to fill empty time. Dawn, when it finally came, was gradual. The absolute darkness began to fade, imperceptibly. At first, the occupant might not notice. Had the darkness lightened slightly, or was it imagination? Then it became clear that the ventilation hole showed a faint grey, rather than pure black. The greyness spread slowly. Walls became barely visible as dark shapes. The ceiling appeared as a lighter surface above. Objects nearby took on vague form. This progression from nothing to something, from blindness to sight, was profound relief. Full daylight, when it came, meant the interior returned to its dim blue glow. This was not bright, but compared to hours of absolute darkness, it seemed almost brilliant. The occupant could see again, could confirm visually what had only been felt during the night, could reconnect with their physical surroundings. The daily light cycle created a rhythm for long-term stays. Activity concentrated during daylight hours, tending ventilation, eating, adjusting bedding, making small improvements to the shelter. Night hours were for attempting sleep, for enduring, for waiting until morning came again. This rhythm was instinctive. Humans are diurnal creatures, active during day and resting at night. Even in survival conditions, this pattern persisted. Light meant activity was possible even if not necessary. Darkness meant cessation, stillness, the reduction of life to its minimum, breathing, warmth conservation, existence. The occupant learned to read subtle light changes as information. A sudden darkening meant clouds thickening or storm intensifying. Gradual brightening might mean snow easing or clouds thinning. Prolonged steady light meant stable conditions. Each variation provided clues about the outside world. Light filtering through the entrance tunnel was particularly informative. If the tunnel showed daylight, the storm had not buried the entrance. If it showed only darkness during daytime hours, either snow had drifted over the entrance or the storm was exceptionally intense. This needed investigation. Blocked entrances meant trapped occupants. Some builders created a secondary light source by thinning a small section of ceiling deliberately. This created a window of sorts, a spot where snow was only 6 or 8 inches thick rather than 2 feet. More light penetrated there, creating a brighter patch during the day. However, this was risky. The thin section was structurally weaker. It might collapse if snow accumulated on top, or if temperatures rose. Most builders avoided this technique, accepting dim conditions rather than compromising structural integrity for slightly better light. The psychological impact of light availability was significant. Studies of isolation have shown that light deprivation causes mood deterioration, cognitive impairment, and psychological distress. Settlers in snow shelters experienced exactly this: days or even weeks of severely limited light exposure. Those who emerged after extended stays reported disorientation when returning to normal daylight. Their eyes had adapted to dimness, making bright snow under full sun initially painful. This adaptation happened gradually during confinement and reversed gradually after emergence. The light environment of SO shelters was one more element of the overall experience, not life-threatening like cold or suffocation, but significant for psychological state and ability to maintain hope and orientation during extended confinement. Light meant connection to the normal world. Darkness meant isolation from it. The daily cycle of light and dark provided structure, confirmation that time was passing, and assurance that eventually the storm would end and full daylight would return. Until that moment, the occupant existed in a twilight world, never fully bright, never completely dark except at night, always tinted blue, always shadowless, always strange. It was one more way that the snow shelter was a liminal space, between normal life and death, between the familiar and the alien. Time moved differently inside a snow shelter. The normal markers that structured days and gave purpose to hours were absent. What remained was undifferentiated duration, time that had to be endured rather than used. The first hours after construction tended to pass quickly. There was still adrenaline from the emergency, fatigue from excavation, the immediate tasks of arranging insulation and settling in. The occupant was busy enough that time seemed to move normally. But after these initial tasks were complete, the reality set in. There was nothing to do. The storm outside continued. Leaving was impossible. The only option was to wait until conditions improved, and that might take hours or days. Without activities to mark time passage, hours blurred together. The occupant lay on their insulated floor, tried to sleep, woke, lay awake, dozed again. This cycle repeated without clear boundaries. It was unclear whether minutes or hours had passed in any given period. Hunger provided some structure. Appetite followed roughly regular intervals even when time cues were absent. The occupant would feel hunger, eat a small amount of their limited food supply, then not feel hungry again for several hours. This created approximate meal intervals, but appetite was suppressed by cold and inactivity. The body's metabolic demands decreased when movement was minimal and temperature was low. Hunger came irregularly, sometimes after what felt like appropriate intervals, sometimes after much longer or shorter periods. Thirst was more pressing than hunger. The body continued losing water through breathing and minimal sweating. This created steady dehydration. But obtaining water required melting snow, which required fire or prolonged body heat application. Both were expensive in terms of resources or effort. Many occupants simply ate snow despite knowing it cooled the body. Small amounts of snow could be melted in the mouth without excessive cooling. This provided some hydration with minimal effort. It was not ideal, but was sustainable for the short term. The need to urinate arose periodically. This presented a practical problem. Leaving the shelter to urinate meant exposing oneself to storm conditions, losing precious heat, and struggling with clothing in brutal cold. But urinating inside meant creating moisture and unpleasant conditions. Most people accepted the necessity of briefly exiting. They would position themselves at the entrance tunnel, sometimes remaining partially inside while attending to needs. This minimized exposure while maintaining shelter hygiene. It was uncomfortable but necessary. These biological necessities, hunger, thirst, elimination, provided the main structure to otherwise structureless time. They were events that marked intervals, gave purpose to small actions, broke up the monotony of lying still in cold darkness or dim light. Between these events, the occupant had to find ways to occupy consciousness. Sleeping was ideal but often impossible. The cold prevented deep sleep. Discomfort made it difficult to remain still enough to fall asleep. Anxiety about the situation kept the mind active. Instead, a state between sleeping and waking became common. The occupant would close their eyes, relax their body, let their thoughts wander. This was not true sleep, but provided rest. It allowed time to pass without the full burden of conscious awareness. When fully awake, thoughts became the only activity. The occupant might review memories, childhood events, family members, pleasant experiences from better times. This mental time travel provided escape from present circumstances and emotional comfort. Others engaged in mental problem solving. They might plan what they would do when the storm ended, the route they would take, how they would explain their absence, what repairs would be needed. This forward thinking provided purpose and hope. Some people prayed. Whether deeply religious or not, the isolation and danger encouraged spiritual reflection. Prayer provided structure, familiar words recited in familiar patterns. It also provided comfort, a sense of not being entirely alone even in physical isolation. Counting remained a common activity. Counting breaths, counting heartbeats, counting to large numbers simply to occupy the mind. Some counted to 1,000, then started over. Others set goals, reached 10,000 counts before allowing themselves to check the ventilation hole or adjust position. Singing was occasional. It required energy and generated moisture from breathing, but it broke the silence and provided rhythmic structure. Songs from childhood were easiest to remember. Work songs, hymns, ballads, anything with strong rhythm and memorable lyrics. Physical activity was extremely limited by the small space. The most that could be done was tensing and relaxing muscle groups while lying still. This prevented some of the stiffness from prolonged immobility and generated minor amounts of heat. But it was not satisfying. Activity, it merely prevented problems rather than accomplishing anything. Checking the shelter's condition became a periodic task. The occupant would run hands over nearby walls, checking for softness that indicated warming or melting. They would look at the ceiling, searching for water droplets. They would test the ventilation hole to ensure it remained open. These checks took only a few minutes but provided purpose. They were necessary tasks that justified action. Finding everything satisfactory was reassuring. The shelter was holding, conditions were stable, survival remained possible. The entrance was checked periodically as well. The occupant would crawl to the tunnel and look outside. This confirmed whether the storm was continuing, whether snow was accumulating, whether daylight or darkness reigned. These observations provided valuable information and broke monotony. But crawling to the entrance meant disturbing carefully arranged insulation and exposing oneself to colder air in the tunnel. So checks were limited, perhaps every few hours during waking periods. Each check was a small expedition, requiring motivation to overcome inertia. The quality of time changed with light conditions. During daylight hours, even the dim blue glow provided enough stimulation that wakefulness was bearable. The occupant could see their surroundings, watch their hands move, maintain visual connection with their environment. During darkness, time became oppressive. With no visual input and minimal sound, there was almost nothing to perceive except internal sensations: cold, discomfort, hunger, fear. These hours were longest, most psychologically difficult, most likely to trigger despair or panic. The storm's duration was always uncertain. A person entering shelter could not know if they would be confined for hours or days. This uncertainty made psychological management difficult. Hope had no specific target. There was no known end time to count down toward. Some storms were brief. A person might shelter for 4 or 5 hours, then emerge to find conditions improved enough for travel. These brief stays were uncomfortable but manageable. The occupant could endure almost anything for a few hours with the endpoint visible. Other storms lasted days. The occupant would shelter overnight, wake expecting improvement, only to find the storm continuing. Then another night. Then another day. The psychological impact accumulated. Hope deferred became hope extinguished. Long stays depleted resources. Food supplies ran low. Matches for fire were consumed. Water became more difficult to obtain as snow supplies within easy reach were used up. The occupant had to begin rationing, extending supplies to match uncertain duration. This rationing created new structure. If 3 matches remained, they might be allocated 1 per day for remaining days. If food was sufficient for 4 more days, it was divided into portions. This planning provided mental activity and sense of control. Physical condition gradually declined during extended stays. Lying still for days caused muscle stiffness and weakness. Limited food intake meant energy levels dropped. Dehydration caused headaches and confusion. Cold exposure, even survivable cold, gradually wore down the body. These physical declines affected mental state. As the body weakened, the mind became more vulnerable to despair, fear, and irrational thoughts. The occupant had to consciously maintain psychological discipline even as physical resources depleted. The waiting was punctuated by brief moments of activity or change, a collapse of frost from the ceiling, a need to adjust insulation, the lighting of a precious fire. The the emergence to check conditions. These moments broke up otherwise undifferentiated time, but fundamentally the experience was one of suspended animation. The occupant existed in a state between normal life and death, doing nothing, going nowhere, simply persisting. Life was reduced to its minimum, breathing, maintaining warmth, enduring. This reduction was psychologically strange. In normal life, identity was bound up with activity, relationships, purpose. In the shelter, all of these were stripped away. The person was reduced to pure existence, a body keeping itself alive, a consciousness waiting for circumstance to change. Some people reported that this reduction was oddly peaceful, without anything to do or decide, without obligations or expectations. There was a simplicity to existence. They simply were, and that was enough. Others found it unbearable. The lack of purpose, the inability to act, the helplessness in face of forces beyond control, these triggered anxiety and despair. They needed to feel they were doing something, even if rationally there was nothing to be done. The rhythm of waiting was not truly rhythmic. It was arrhythmic, irregular, without pattern, without crescendo or resolution. It simply continued until it ended, and the end came not from anything the occupant did, but from the storm passing in its own time. This waiting was the heart of the snow shelter experience. Construction was brief, emergence was brief, but the waiting, the long hours of lying still, staying warm enough to live, enduring discomfort and fear and boredom, this was what survival actually consisted of. And when the waiting finally ended, when conditions improved enough for emergence, when the occupant crawled out into its transformed landscape, the memory that would persist was not of the construction or the cold, but of the waiting, the strange suspended time when life consisted of nothing but continuing to breathe. Sleep inside a snow shelter was never comfortable and rarely came easily. The conditions that kept a person alive, cold, enclosed space, rough bedding, were exactly the conditions that made rest difficult. Yet sleep was necessary, both for passing time and for conserving energy. The cold alone made sleep challenging. Even with adequate insulation underneath and blankets or robes above, temperature inside the shelter remained well below normal sleeping conditions. A person's extremities, toes, fingers, nose, stayed uncomfortably cold regardless of body position. Cold disrupted the body's normal sleep cycle. As core temperature dropped even slightly, the body responded by generating heat through shivering. Shivering was involuntary and made remaining still impossible. The occupant would shake, wake from the movement, wait for shivering to subside, then try to sleep again. Position was constrained by space limitations. The shelter was barely longer than a person lying down. There was no room to stretch out fully. Knees had to remain slightly bent. Arms were tucked close to the body for warmth. This forced position became uncomfortable after even short periods. The hard surface underneath provided no give. Even with straw or blankets as padding, pressure points developed. Hip bones pressed hard against the floor. Shoulder blades compressed bedding until bone contacted snow. These pressure points became painful, requiring position shifts. But shifting position was difficult. The occupant was wrapped in whatever blankets or robes they had, which restricted movement. The space was so small that rolling over required coordinated effort, and any movement disturbed the carefully arranged insulation and let in cold air. The result was a compromise between comfort and warmth. The person would tolerate discomfort until it became unbearable, then shift position quickly, pull coverings back into place and wait for warmth to rebuild before attempting sleep again. This cycle repeated through the night. Brief sleep, gradual pain build-up, position shift, recovery of warmth, another attempt at sleep. True deep sleep was rare. What occurred was more like a series of shallow naps interrupted by discomfort and cold. Darkness aided sleep by removing visual stimulation. During night hours, there was nothing to see, even if the occupant's eyes were open. This reduced external stimulation to nearly zero, making it easier for the mind to disengage and drift towards sleep. But darkness also created vulnerability to anxious thoughts. Without visual distraction, worries became more intrusive. The occupant might lie awake thinking about whether the shelter would hold, whether they would suffocate, whether they would freeze despite their preparations. These thoughts triggered physical stress responses, increased heart rate, faster breathing, muscle tension. These responses made sleep even more difficult and increased heat loss through accelerated metabolism. The person had to consciously calm themselves, which required effort that true rest should not require. Some people found that focusing on breathing helped. Slow, deliberate breaths in a regular pattern gave the mind something to focus on besides worry. The rhythm was calming. Oxygen intake improved, which helped maintain body warmth. Sleep sometimes came more easily with this focus. Others used memory as a sleep aid. They would recall pleasant scenes in detail, a summer day, a warm room, a comfortable bed. This visualization created mental escape from current discomfort. Sometimes the mind would drift from visualization into actual dreams without clear boundary. Prayer or recitation served similar purposes. The familiar words required just enough mental engagement to prevent anxious thoughts, but not so much that they prevented sleep. Many people reported falling asleep mid-prayer, the words trailing off into unconsciousness. Dreams, when they came, were often disturbing. The cold and discomfort intruded into dream content. People dreamed of being buried, of being unable to breathe, of freezing. They would wake suddenly from these dreams, momentarily confused about where they were and whether the danger was real. Other dreams were compensatory, dreams of warmth, comfort, home, family. These provided psychological relief even while sleeping. Waking from them was disappointing, a return to harsh reality. But the brief escape was valuable. The boundary between sleep and waking became blurred during extended stays. The occupant might not be sure if they had slept or only closed their eyes and rested. Without time markers and in sensory deprivation, consciousness itself became ambiguous. This half state was not restorative like true sleep, but was better than full wakefulness. The body relaxed somewhat. The mind's constant activity slowed. Energy was conserved. These benefits helped survival, even if the occupant never achieved deep, restful sleep. Physical exhaustion eventually overrode discomfort to some degree. After hours of minimal sleep, the body's need for rest became so strong that it forced some level of unconsciousness despite cold and pain. These exhaustion-induced sleep periods were the deepest rest available, but even these were interrupted. Cold would wake the person after an hour or two. They would need to move stiff joints, adjust position, pull coverings tighter. Then the process of trying to sleep would begin again. Shared shelters created different sleep dynamics. If two people were present, their combined body heat raised temperature slightly, making sleep somewhat easier. But they also disturbed each other with movements, sounds, and competition for limited insulation. Some people tried sleeping in shifts, one person remaining somewhat alert while the other attempted rest. This provided some safety monitoring but meant neither person could fully relax into deep sleep. The awareness that one should wake periodically prevented complete rest. Sleeping positions varied based on what provided the most warmth. Fetal position with knees drawn to chest minimized exposed surface area and kept extremities close to core heat. This was the warmest position, but became painful for hip joints after prolonged time. Sleeping on one side was common, but meant the lower shoulder and hip took constant pressure. Alternating sides distributed this pressure, but required frequent position changes. Back sleeping exposed more surface area to cold, but distributed weight more evenly. Most people ended up rotating through positions throughout the night. Side, back, other side, briefly fetal, then repeating. This constant adjustment meant sleep was always light, always interruptible, never approaching the deep rest of comfortable conditions. Morning, when daylight finally returned, often found the occupant already awake. The transition from darkness to dim light was noticeable even through closed eyelids. This natural wake signal aligned somewhat with the body's circadian rhythm, making morning waking easier than midnight waking. But waking brought awareness of cold, stiffness, and discomfort that had been dormant during sleep. The first moments of consciousness were often the hardest, the realization that the ordeal was continuing, that another day of waiting lay ahead. Some people forced themselves to remain lying down for a period after waking. Movement without preparation meant exposing warm skin to cold air. It was better to lie still, let full consciousness return, plan what movements were necessary, then execute them efficiently. Others found that lying awake was worse than moving. They would rise as soon as consciousness returned, check the shelter, perhaps crawl to the entrance to assess conditions. Activity, even minimal activity, provided purpose and generated small amounts of heat. The quality of sleep directly affected psychological state. A night with several hours of actual rest left the person more resilient, better able to maintain hope and discipline. A night of shivering wakefulness led to deteriorating mental state, increased vulnerability to despair. Over multiple days, sleep deprivation accumulated. The body's need for rest became desperate. People would fall asleep at odd times, midday, while eating, while checking the entrance. These microsleeps were the body forcing rest however it could obtain it. But microsleeps during waking hours meant less sleep at night, creating a vicious cycle. The person's sleep schedule became completely disrupted. They existed in a state of constant partial exhaustion, never fully asleep but never fully alert. This exhaustion was dangerous. It impaired judgment and decision-making. A person who needed to decide whether to wait longer or attempt emergence in marginal conditions might make poor choices due to exhaustion. Many deaths occurred because people left shelter too early, possibly due to impaired thinking from sleep deprivation. Yet despite all difficulties, sleep was achieved to some degree. The human body adapted as it could. The mind found ways to disconnect from discomfort enough to allow rest. Survival depended on this adaptation, and the body fought for it even in the most adverse conditions. The sleep obtained in snow shelters was never adequate, never comfortable, never truly restorative. But it was enough. Combined with the body's other survival mechanisms, it allowed people to endure until conditions improved and emergence became possible. And when they finally left the shelter and returned to normal sleeping conditions, many reported that the first full night of warm, comfortable sleep was among the most profound experiences of their lives, appreciated in ways that only those who had slept in snow could fully understand.